to think there was a holiday today, which there isn't. That was Friday. There was a 4-day weekend, but it was Friday through Monday. I sent you on email, so it looks like at least a fair majority, about 2/3 of the enrolled students got that email, and you're going to benefit, and you'll be glad you did log in, because we're covering some of the most iconic artwork of the entire high Renaissance. I gave you the definition of what that means. The peak Renaissance artwork by the greatest Renaissance artists tonight, like Michelangelo and Raphael, and some of the points of interpretation and controversy even over some of those works, which some of you may have heard about, but I'm pretty sure most of you won't have. For instance, who is the strange-looking woman behind God or under his arm in the painting of Adam, The Birth of Adam by Michelangelo? There's a big debate about that. Okay, I'm going to let in a couple more people. Hello. Okay, welcome. So we're just getting started. What I want to do is, I'm going to go to full screen here. Take a minute. Yeah. Is to make sure that you all have the information correct about how to submit your papers. It's not for 2 weeks, but still, it's important to make sure there's no uncertainty about that. So I did this last week, and I'm doing it again this week in case you either signed in late or you haven't watched the video, which was posted by Friday, as it always is, on YouTube. This is what you need to use as the identifying or tag, labeling, I meant to say labeling of the actual files you send me. Remember, they have to be PDFs. I'll remind you all of this more than once before the papers are due. And then you need to write on the actual file title so that I or my readers can make sure we know which class and what assignment you're turning in. And that's Art 1.2, right? Short paper number 1, underline, and then your last name, comma, first name. If you do it that way, it won't get mixed up. It won't get lost. I'll hold that up for another few seconds. So if anyone wants to take a screenshot, then you will get your paper back in a timely manner, meaning with all the others that were turned in on time, assuming you turn yours in on time. And so, of course, it's really important to do that, because if you don't, your paper could get mislaid or not properly logged in, or just put on a to-do later pile, which means it wouldn't be graded with the others and would be sent back. Your grade, wouldn't be available until after all the late papers are graded. So you don't want that to happen if you put the effort into getting it done on time. Okay, the cover sheets. That's the only other announcement, and we'll get to tonight's slides because we have a lot to cover. I'll cut at least one of the slides, and we'll probably still end early tonight. But we have enough that we're going to go, like we usually do till 8:30, then take a break. Or 8, I meant 8, sorry. That's right, it's 6:30 to 9:30. I'm so used to teaching 7 to 10. Like a usual break halfway through, 15 minutes, and still end early. But after the break, there's going to be some material that could easily be on the midterm. So don't sign off, please. Okay. So the other announcement is that the cover sheets, I actually sent you guys sample papers, but I didn't send the actual separate file, PDF file of just the 1-page cover sheet. That's how we grade all the papers. I and the readers can't grade them without it. So if you turned your paper in without that, it would be counted late and have points off even before you start grading it. So you don't want that to happen. So you will get that from me before this weekend, probably no later than Friday. And you can check your inbox certainly over the weekend, or at least by Monday before the next class, so that I will double check that everyone got it. If there's some problem, there shouldn't be any problem in opening it, but if occasionally a glitch occurs with individual email accounts from certain student emails, it can happen. You just need to shoot me an email and I'll forward it to you individually. So you should have those cover sheets and use them as a kind of a template. That's what I suggested last week when we went over how to write the papers. That's already on the recorded lecture that's on YouTube. So I won't go into all that again. But the point is that that's a checklist is another way to look at it, to make sure you didn't overlook any of the 9 elements or the requirements for the bibliography. or citing or sources within the text. All those things are in the 5 requirements for your short papers. You all were sent that over a week ago. We went over it in class last week. So you'll get those cover sheets from me in the next 3 or 4 days. So certainly by Saturday, you should be able to check, and they should be in your inbox. And you do want to use, you need, if you want an A and have your paper graded on time, to use those cover sheets and attach them to your own paper as a PDF file, a single file that's, therefore all in one place when you send it to me, to my markw@aol.com. I actually double checked just today. I thought just out of curiosity, the spam file for my AOL account. And I saw that there were a couple of students who told me they hadn't heard back from me to confirm I got your mini bios, but they told me, so they're fine. I didn't drop anybody that has been in the class. That I triple check that. It's so important. I don't want to make that mistake. I'd rather have a student or two still on the roster who don't belong than the reverse of people being dropped when they shouldn't be. So I didn't do that, but I realize that means I'm going to have to double check at the end of, let's say, each week or so, my spam file. I have a spam folder. That is one reason I use AOL, because it's not a high spam filter. I meant to say filter. That is not as thorough as the one on Outlook. I mean, is not as thorough as the one I have on AOL. And there's just so much junk coming through on Outlook. Things from Dallas high school classmates. I've been to Dallas once at the airport. What? I went to high school in Thousand Oaks, in Southern California. Yeah, so there's a lot of junk comes through on Outlook. So that's why I ask you to send all your documents, all your extra credit if you can. Individual email communication or questions you can send to either the Outlook or Mark W. But anything you want credit for, any assignment or extra credit, you need to send to markw@aol.com. Okay, so I do have one other announcement, and we'll get started with tonight's lecture. But first, are there any questions that have been, bubbling through your minds about the papers that I haven't already answered? Anybody? Yes, William?
Is there anything specific you wish us to focus on, and like a period in history or a specific kind of art?
No, yeah, I mentioned that last week, but it just, obviously bears repeating. I always do that because I can understand why you might assume I would want you to write about something that's from the time frame or even on the syllabus. But no, I want to give your imagination, your creative abilities, what have you, free reign. Meaning you pick any work of art that interests you, that you can find 3 new sources on. Isn't that what they're doing in Burma? I think it is, against the military dictatorship. By the way, I'm going to talk about that later on. Burma is the right name for that country. Myanmar is the dictatorship's way of trying to deflect the attention of the world from the 50 years of dictatorship they had before they got their democracy, and now they're taking it away again, the military. So I don't call it Myanmar. I call it Burma, as do most journalists who've been there. I've been to Southeast Asia. So anyway, the point is that 3, right, sources are, what you need to know. Before you start writing a paper, just make sure you can research it with 3 new sources that you can put into a bibliography. Otherwise, you're free to choose any work of art except your own, because that would be cheating. Obviously, it'd be too close to the subject. You yourself know, I hope, without having to research the meaning of a work you created. But it can be someone even in your own family, a family member. That's okay, because you could still then interview with the artist or something as a source, one of your new sources. But there have to be at least one source that was originally printed. Remember that. That's all in the handout I went over in detail last week. But no, you pick anything you want. Make sure it's something you care about and that interests you enough to want to write about and learn more about. Okay, speaking one other aspect of writing, I'm kind of, I guess, pleased is the right word, to see that an op-ed I wrote about 2 weeks ago and submitted to 3 different Bay Area newspapers where I know the editors has been accepted. Well, one for sure is running on Thursday, the Alameda newspaper. That guy, the editor there, used to be my editor when I had a newspaper column. You can get extra points, benefit to all of you if you care to. You don't have to read it, but hopefully you would. It's only 600 words. It's called Abraham Lincoln's True legacy. But it's not just about that, the whole controversy over schools named for Lincoln. It goes well beyond that, to the whole question of what is and isn't appropriate, standards to honor anyone from past history in our history, American history, and the debate over that. I think you'll find it interesting and relevant, and it should be running in the Santa Rosa Press Democrat, possibly as early as Saturday or Sunday. So I will shoot people an email once I know for sure if that is definite. I just talked to the editor live, of the editor of the op-ed page of the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. It's a really well respected paper. It gets national journalistic awards quite often. And a number of my former students who were journalism majors went to work, at least temporarily, as interns for that paper. And I've had maybe, I don't know, possibly half a dozen pieces. So the same piece would probably be without any major editing, but perhaps a different title. Either one. In other words, I will shoot you an email to remind you, all my classes, this. If you just send me some kind of either a screenshot or a link that shows me you actually access the article, because of course they're available online, let alone you actually might, if it's in the Santa Rosa paper, care enough to go out and read it in print. I realize that's not likely, but they do both. Newspapers do both a print edition. The Alameda Sun, it's called Alameda Sun.com, of course. You can Google that easy enough. And the other one, Santa Rosa Press Democrat.com. They have, of course, all their pieces are online as well as in print editions. So if you show me proof that you accessed either a print edition of either newspaper or both, if you choose to, you get 5 points, just like you would for any other article. So it's an easy 5 points. Plus, if you care to comment in terms of, your reaction, it can be confidential. It won't be seen by anybody but me. You get another 5 points because, of course, there are a lot of ways to look at these kinds of controversies. And art, after all, that's what good art is. It makes you think about things in a different way, maybe, than you would otherwise. All right. So one last time, are there any questions I didn't already answer? There was just one for now. And of course, you can email me at any point about your papers if you just, 2 people that joined us after we started. Okay, because of course, next week will be one more week in which, before the papers due, you'll still have a chance to ask questions live. Okay, so we are going to talk about high Renaissance art, and we're going to talk about Michelangelo mostly tonight. But first, we are going to finish up with 2. Let me hide the thumbnails here. There we go. 2 of the Da Vinci. They're not on the syllabus, so you've already written about the 2 must-knows. And boy, are either one of those important enough that you should study them carefully, because one of, or the two, or the other of those 2, that would be the Last Supper or the Mona Lisa, is a very high possibility of being on the midterm. Okay, you don't have to write this now, but I just want you to look. This is another Da Vinci painting of Mary, the Virgin, quote unquote, Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, and her cousin. I think her name was Elizabeth. I can't never remember. And that's baby Jesus there, supposedly. Or is it? Some people say, no, this isn't Jesus. This is John the Baptist, who was his, of course, cousin, Jesus's cousin, because these women were related. And that's symbolic, the sheep of Jesus himself. But then that kind of is, assuming Da Vinci was being more mysterious than perhaps he was. So all we're saying is that this is a religious scene that's not anything new. But look at the background. That's what I wanted to emphasize. Look at this sfumato. Remember, I gave you that definition. You will need to know that. It'll certainly come up on the midterm, of this light hazy kind of look in the background. He pioneered something, he invented, but we can't prove that. But he pioneered as one of the first artists to use that technique on his backgrounds, or you could just say his landscapes. Okay, and then we see the other technique he's famous for. And this is one of those bits of history that we now have enough evidence that when I started teaching, even up until 4, 5, 6 years ago, there wasn't a conclusive research, but now there is, about Da Vinci's personal life. This is a portrait of a noblewoman from one of the many city-states. Italy was not a country during the Renaissance. It was just a bunch of separate cities. Each one had their own small little kingdom around them. Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome. And so she was from one of those city-states. I forget which one, not one of the four I just mentioned, but she was a lifelong, well, let's say long-term friend of Da Vinci's. And there used to be speculation that they had a romantic connection, but now we know, no, that's not true. Da Vinci was definitely gay. And there's evidence for that now. It's very conclusive. But he had these intense emotional connections to women who were intelligent, perceptive, who were somewhat constructive critics of his art, gave him suggestions and, as well as support, of course. And he would correspond with them, or when he was in their city, he'd meet with them in person. All through his adult life, he admired women who had a mind of their own, which is not typical of most Renaissance men. Okay, we covered this, but now, right, we're going to start. This is the first must know tonight, so it's on your syllabus, so you should have that out. As many of you can tell by looking, it's David, the title. See, there are 3 Davids in this class. And any one of them is different. Each one, I mean, of those 3 are different enough that any one of them could appear on, not more than one of them will, of course, appear on the midterm. So you want to take thorough notes. In others, I'm not cutting this slide. It's very important. I think you've all seen pictures of this statue. So let's talk about it. But first, defining it again, Michelangelo. I know you can all spell that. He always just uses his first name, Michelangelo, and the date is 1504. He was a busy man that year. He did a lot of different sculptures, and he began new projects for other, patrons or clients. This one, here we are. Here's the first fact you should have about the meaning of this. This sculpture is the largest human figure ever carved out of a single piece of stone. You could say largest known, because it could be there was something in the past, but if there was something bigger than this somewhere in history, it would have been recorded. So I'll say it again, but thoroughly, slowly, that, as far as we can be certain, this is the largest known human figure ever carved out of a single piece of stone. How big is it, you might ask? Well, that's part of the meaning. This block of stone was over 19 feet long. And several artists had tried to work with it and gave up. So it actually had been partially carved around the, just the corners, the edges of it. So it was a rejected piece of marble, not because the quality was perfect. Obviously, look at it. There was no flaws in the marble. So he took a piece that had been overlooked or that other artists couldn't handle. It was just too big for them. And he created this statue, which is itself 16 and a half. I'm rounding up. It's 16 feet, 6 inches, but that's close. 16 feet, 5 and a half. So just say it is, as it stands, including the base, this sculpture is 16 and a half feet tall. That is nearly 3 times the normal height of an adult male. And anybody here been there? I think I saw in your mini bios a couple of people here had been to Florence. It's in Florence. You don't have to know that for the exam. Well, if you ever go, you should definitely take the time to walk around this piece and look at it from every angle. And believe me, it will blow you away. It's just remarkable. Okay, so he created this. It took him over a year because he had other projects. He was always multitasking. As you know, he was a great painter, and he hadn't started painting the Sistine Chapel. We'll get to that, I think, in the next slide. But this piece took him a lot less time than most sculptors would have taken. A little over a year. Some say 15 months. Anyway, and then it had to be dragged through the streets of Florence to be placed in front of the town hall. There's a name for that you'll have to know, but it was the Palazzo Vecchio, which means the old town hall. So just say it was placed in front of their city hall on public display. And why was it placed there? Because, again, it was a piece, this is all part of the meaning, I'll say this slowly and repeat it, a piece of political propaganda. This was also a piece of propaganda, political statement. What about? Again, about an enemy, same city, actually. You don't have to know the name. It was Milan, which is a much bigger city. Just say a city that was an enemy city of, or rival, of Florence. It was threatening them to invade them. They actually did at one point. But this statue, at least, when it was erected at his, put up in the square in front of City Hall, served as kind of a warning. Again, like the first David, remember we covered that last week by Donatello 100 years earlier nearly, that if what was the point they were making about this? Here we are. I'll say it slowly, repeat it, and then I'll answer any question if there's one. Hold off. This is what the government of Florence was trying to say with this statue. If you, to Milan, to their enemies, if you attack us, we'll do to you what David did to Goliath, which of course was kill him, defeat him in battle. See, he's got his slingshot. You may be able to tell that. Let's get up close. And there is his stone. Now, did someone have a question? I thought I heard someone. Okay, so he had both, the weapons in his hands, right? The rock and the slingshot he used to shoot it. And then he was nude. Now, that's just one interpretation. There are times when he's shown, most of the time in the Renaissance, statue of David showed him nude. But there's no, I don't think, description of him that way in the Bible. So the point of this is that it shows how much, the other fact about the meaning you should write is, this sculpture shows how much of a master of the human body, of depicting the human body, both as a painter and as a sculptor, Michelangelo had become. He became the best portrayer of the human body, and he usually painted and sculpted all his human figures, and even his holy figures, many of them, in the nude. He had learned, remember, how to do that by dissecting cadavers. We covered that the first night of class, with the slide of the Libyan Sibyl. So he usually, now that she wasn't nude, but most of the paintings on the ceiling of that chapel, you'll see that in a couple more slides, were nude. And all of his sculptures were, almost all, not all, but most of his sculptures, say most. And this is his most famous, of course. So that's the main part of the meaning. The last fact about it that you should have in your, and we'll do the formal analysis. What's happening here? Well, let's look at his face. It's before the battle. That's an important detail. This is him gathering his strength. There's different ways to say that. Anybody here an actor? Maybe you know this. My father was an actor. There's a way you describe that moment before you go on stage. Have somebody playing a radio or something back when, before you go on stage to do a part in a play or, on TV or something, you have to focus. It's called centering. That's what actors that I know. I did a little bit of acting, but only in college. My dad is in several movies, actually. And his movies are still being shown on Netflix. Anyway, the point is that having that kind of, concentration, it's called, here we go, the last fact about the meaning. Now, it's the way Michelangelo described this. Somebody's distracting us all there with your, can you turn off the radio or the, oh boy, yeah, if I knew which one it was, I guess I could mute them, but I try not to mute my students. All right, I'm just going to pull ahead and hope that subsides. Thank you. So what's he doing? It's called action in repose. I will finish that, repeat that last final fact about the meaning. That's what Michelangelo called this pose, this concentration. You see it in his face, in his eyes, right? He's looking at Goliath thinking, I got one shot at this. I better make it count. Right. So that's called action in repose, quote unquote. It's a direct quote from Michelangelo. Okay. Now, there's somebody with a radio on, because that is frustrating, but I guess I can talk over it. Yeah, that happens about once every 2 or 3 weeks, I'm afraid, in one or the other of my classes. Unless we've got a glitch, which if it is, there's anything I can do about that. So I'm just going to talk loud and repeat what I say, and let's hope that disappears soon. All right, so formal analysis is pretty easy on this one. It's a cool white color. It is larger than life, and it's three-dimensional. So what is the space? It's real space. It is 16 and a half feet tall. There isn't any techniques for space. It's a single mass, or is it? You could break it down and say, well, the second largest mass is the base, and then the slingshot. And if you really want to get thorough, you could say the smallest, the fourth largest, is the stone in his left hand. Okay, so we could just keep it simple and say it is one large mass and then a smaller mass for the base and the slingshot. And then we have the rhythm. Oh yeah, it's human body, of course, and it's intact. So it's got two arms, two legs, two hands, two feet, and the face has got plenty of rhythm as all faces do. The symbiotic texture, superb on the skin, the hair, the face. All of that is done, and the hands. All of that's done with carved line, of course. There is no modeling. It's just the shadows are from the museum lighting. There's no technique for modeling. Is he stable or dynamic? Well, he's standing in contrapposto. Remember, I told you that word will definitely come up on the midterm. That means his weight is on his back foot, right? And his front leg, I meant, is on his back leg, and the front leg is loose. And he's got one arm down and the other raised. But his spine forms a gentle S curve. You can see that if you follow the arrow here. What would that mean? That means that it's slightly dynamic, but really he's standing upright mostly. So you could say it's both. I mean, obviously his head's turned, and the top of his head, of course, right? Obviously is curved, so it's dynamic. But those are details. It's mostly stable with some dynamic detail. Okay, and it's balanced because it's a full-size human figure standing upright and not running, right, or moving. Okay, this isn't a must know, but it's the second largest sculpture that we know of ever carved from a single piece of stone, and it's another Michelangelo. It's not on syllabus, so just listen for a minute and we'll move on to the next must know. This is Moses. It's a statue of Moses that's in front of the, or part of the tomb of the Pope. You have to know which one, but if you care to, it's actually a topic that could be interesting for your papers if you haven't chosen one, because there's a lot of history and research about this. This is part of the tomb, or a figure in front of the tomb of Pope Julius II. He's the one that ordered Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel and ordered him to design his own tomb. Well, while he was still alive. And then the tomb wasn't finished till long after that pope died. So just say a pope's tomb. If you're thinking of writing about it, you could look it up. You don't have to write this though. So it's about the equivalent of a 14 or 15 foot high figure. Now he's seated, of course. So if he were to stand up, he would be nearly within a foot or two as tall as the figure of David. So that's why I just say most historians consider this. I mean, there's no absolute certainty because, hey, he's seated for one thing, so it's hard to compare. But many historians consider this to be the second largest single human figure, I'm sorry, carved out of a single piece of marble. And of course, it's marble. But let's move on. And now we get to the next must know, which I'll give you the title. It's the detail on the ceiling here. And that is the birth of Adam. The birth of Adam, of course, is Adam, and the artist is Michelangelo, and the date is 1512. If you haven't been to Florence, again, I'd swear a couple of you said you'd been to. This is, of course, in Rome. Did I say Florence? I apologize. It's at the Vatican, which is, of course, where the Pope lives. It's a chapel the Pope has as a private chapel for him and his invited guests, like other bishops and things. But now it's open to the public. As you know, if you ever go there, I hope you'll get to see it. You have to wait in a bit of a line. It's a very popular thing, but it's worth the wait to look up at this 65 feet high above your heads, all of these frescoes. So let's look at the birth of Adam, one of them. That's the next one we're going to look at. Now, there's a lot to say about this, and this is where the controversies come in. So we'll say these things slowly and repeat them on the meaning. First of all, it's a scene from the Bible. It's a fresco. Remember, we already covered the definition of that. On the ceiling of, now you should say, is part of the meaning, the location. It's not just a church, it's a very specific one, and I'll spell it. But again, if you don't spell it exactly right, you don't get points off on the midterm, if it's on the midterm. At Sistine, it's called. You probably heard that word if you ever heard the location for these frescoes. Sistine, Sistine Chapel. So this is on the ceiling of a chapel in Rome called the Sistine Chapel, and it's one of 18 frescoes painted by Michelangelo on that ceiling. All of those frescoes, so I'm repeating this thing I started with, are scenes from the Bible, and this one is the one where God supposedly creates Adam. So let's get up close. And that's God. There's no debating over these facts. And of course, this would have to be Adam because he's down on earth. See, that's a rocky outcropping, but just say he's down on earth. And God is supposed to be up in heaven. And he's literally giving life from the such an important image. It's been used on computer advertising and websites, and of course all kinds of recreations of this work of art have been used for centuries. It's one of the most famous. Yes,
like the one used for ET.
yeah.
I can imagine it took
That's a good
inspiration from
point.
that.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It is similar to the whole thing of ET. Spielberg definitely was thinking of this painting when he, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Anyway, the point is giving life by, the force. Of course, supposedly God has the power to give or take life, according to the Bible. Anyway, so he's passing the energy, if you want to call it, the life energy from his, soul, because he's not supposed to be a physical being, right? In heaven to the actual physical body of there is Adam, the first man. But there are some problems with let's say questions, not problems, controversies or questions, you say it either way, with the interpretation of this scene by Michelangelo. Michelangelo was another one of those artists, along with Da Vinci and others, who it was assumed was perhaps heterosexual. Then it was assumed he was just gay, and now there's some evidence he could have been perhaps just asexual. But we do know that he had. All we can say for sure is there's no proof either way. Like there is about Da Vinci. We know Da Vinci was gay, and that he had gay, relationships during his lifetime with consenting adults. Okay, that no one argues with anymore. Now, with Michelangelo, all we know is he had strong attachments to several intelligent, powerful females that he knew throughout his career as an artist, just like Da Vinci did. But there's no evidence they had any more than just platonic friendships between them. And there's no proof that he had any intimate relationships with men. We do know he had interest in that, but he probably repressed it because he was afraid of the Catholic Church of saying he was breaking their rules. And the Catholic Church, after all, the popes, right? Who else would that be? Were his biggest patrons, the ones who hired him. So just say it this way. There is some evidence, now you should write this part, that this woman here, I think as close as we can get, you see her face? She doesn't look happy. So who is she? She's looking past, God's act of bringing this lump of clay. According to the Bible, Adam was a lifeless lump of clay until God gave him life, down on earth, and that she's supposed to go down there and be his mate, right? That would be the traditional interpretation of any woman near, or beside God, we could just say, or up in heaven, whose soul he will send down to what? Become the first woman, Eve. So Eve, sorry, E-V-E, I said it right. Eve, right? According to the Bible, is the first woman. But wait a minute, there's a problem with that interpretation. Michelangelo wasn't following the rules on this one. If strict adherence or strict, whatever, obedience to the stories in the Bible was the case, he wasn't doing that. He was breaking that tradition or that taboo. Why? Because according to the Bible, Eve didn't exist until after Adam had been alive for a while, and she was created out of one of his ribs, which I think is one of the strangest stories. But anyway, that's what it says in the Bible. So how could Eve be alive and obviously intelligent? Look at her face, a very observant and intelligent woman, before Adam was, even as Adam, obviously was there before God touches Adam's fingers. So if it's not Eve, which is what many people assume for centuries, there is another explanation, maybe a couple of you have heard of, which is another powerful female spirit that the Jewish texts before the Bible we're talking about, right? The Jewish scholars from before Jesus's time used to write about. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Anybody? Lilith, Lilith. Lilith was a powerful female soul or spirit, you can say it either way, whom God first, supposedly, according to the Jewish versions of the Bible, sent down to earth to be Adam's first mate, and she wouldn't obey him. She wouldn't be subservient, right? Or, obedient. And he asked God to take her away, which, according to some versions of the Jewish text, God then banished her to the end of the universe, and she's been creating all kinds of havoc for human beings on earth ever since. Again, either way you look at it, those two versions are not very open-minded when it comes to equality of the sexes. Neither one does. But if it is Lilith and not Eve that Michelangelo is trying to portray, so those are the two leading theories. It could be a third explanation. This is just some kind of a thing. But look at her face. She clearly is reacting to the fact that God is giving life to a lump of clay, and she doesn't seem happy. So it's probably because she's going to be sent down to earth. So it's either Eve or Lilith, almost certainly. And either way, you get, I hope everyone's clear on this, and if not, ask me and I'll restate it. Michelangelo's breaking the rules here by showing an intelligent, aware female figure up in heaven before Adam's born, who will then be sent down to be his companion, whether it is Lilith or Eve. Neither version is what the Catholic Church wanted you to focus on, because supposedly Eve is the only one they want you to talk about in the Christian Bible, right? In the traditional Catholic version of this event, well, Christian version. So that shows that Michelangelo was not just going to follow tradition, and it also is an indication he probably had one of his strong, powerful female friends or patrons pose for this image. We don't know that for sure. Okay, so that's plenty on the meaning. I mean, you could, of course, also comment on the perfect physique of Adam. And again, that's part of the meaning we already covered about Michelangelo's ability, both in painting and sculpture. But if you want to, you could add that, if this is on the midterm, that it's also one of the facts about the meaning that Michelangelo clearly here proves what a master he was at depicting the human body in great detail, because he'd learned how to do that by cutting up cadavers. Okay, formal analysis is pretty straightforward. I call it roughly balanced because see the size of this cloud. Is it a cloud? Some think it's supposed to be symbolic of the human brain, with the brain stem, leading to the spinal cord. Maybe, but I don't think, maybe if it was Da Vinci, it might, because I don't know. It doesn't really, there's no evidence for that. That's just a guess. It just looks like a cloud that they're supposedly up in heaven, all of these spirits here, along with these baby angels. Remember the cherubs here, and God and this woman, which I think is Lilith, but it could be Eve. And so the area covered by the rock outcropping, just say by earth down below and the cloud in the sky, are about equal. They're roughly equal. And the two bodies, God and Adam, are about the same. So they're balanced roughly. And then we have the rhythm, of course. Look at all the heads, arms, of course, legs. It's a lot of rhythm, and it's super sharp and realistic. Symmetric textures on the skin, the hair, and what clothing there is. You see, God isn't nude, Adam is. So all the details are very strong and realistic symmetric textures, but the modeling is also strong on the figures, sacred, you could say, or holy figures, or spiritual, and Adam's body. That's all super sharp modeling, but the background behind them isn't. That's soft and diffused, that modeling. And that actually is an indication of atmospheric perspective. You see the blue hazy look in the distance. But otherwise, the techniques for space, in addition to some limited use of atmospheric perspective, there's no scientific perspective, there's no horizon, no vanishing point. But there is overlapping, foreshortening, of course, and diminishing size, you could say, because these people's heads are smaller than God's or Adam's. So those are the four techniques: diminishing size, foreshortening, overlapping, and atmospheric perspective for space. The outlines are bold on all the figures, human and holy figures. It's dynamic. I don't see a single stable line in it. And of course, let's see, what do we, oh yeah, the colors here are, is that a warm purple or a cool? You decide. But it's obviously cool on God's rose, but warm on all the skin tones, and cool on the background here. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to give you guys a break and cut this so we can get to some of the other really important must-knows without your, getting tired of writing notes before we get to our break. But I'm going to tell you what it is. So take your pens now and go ahead and cross it. It definitely won't be, you don't have to take notes now, and you could just listen for, I won't go into detail, just a brief mention. Why is it originally part of the syllabus? It's not a minor building or small building. It may be physically small, but it's not unimportant. But we got to cut something, I promised you. So everyone see that week 4, third slide down on the list of slides to know is Tempietto. I don't need to spell it because you don't have to study it or write about it. Bramante 1502. So why did I even put it on here? Because this is a test case, you could say, or prototype for St. Peter's. It was part of a competition. So again, you could just listen. You don't have to remember this. By the Pope, the same Pope that hired Michelangelo to do the Sistine Chapel we just looked at. Also had a contest. Michelangelo entered that contest. It's going to come up in one of the another must know. So this is relevant to the future architecture slide of Michelangelo's dome, the dome he designed for St. Peter's. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But for now, you could just hear me out. This was a part of a contest, a competition is a better word, architectural competition that the Pope sponsored, in which he asked all the best architects in Italy, which of course include Michelangelo, which by the way, a lot of people don't think of him as an architect, but he liked his architecture. He felt that's what he did best. And on his epitaph, that's what he had listed first, that he was an architect, before mentioning a sculpture, and last that he was a painter. He thought he was just a mediocre painter, but of course that was wrong. He was brilliant at all three. So this was a competition, and Bramante won it because of this little building. It's behind the main papal quarters, they're called, where the Pope actually lives. It's a small chapel. It's still, the last time I checked, it was used for storage by the Pope. Certainly during this pandemic, I'm sure it's not used for services, but it has over the centuries been occasionally used as a small chapel for worship by the Pope and any small group of people he wants to invite. So it got, in other words, the commission for the architect whose name was Bramante. Bramante he was older than Michelangelo and already established as an architect. Michelangelo was just starting his career as an architect when he joined the competition. So his design got passed over. Anybody who's been in an artistic competition knows how that feels. He was disappointed, but he had plenty of other projects, so he put it behind him. And this was the one that got accepted. And the architect who designed this little miniature temple, it's not miniature, that makes it sound like it's a small scale. It's called a gem, a very small scale, but functioning building, was so well liked. The Pope liked this design so much that he hired Bramante, gave him the commission to design St. Peter's. Okay, but you didn't have to write that. Now you do on this one. So the two slides, of course, relate to each other. So now this one is also another one I'm not going to cut from the study list because it's such an unusual and influential structure. Okay, this is the Dome of St. Peter's. You see it's just fourth down on your list of slides from this week, slides to know. Dome of St. and of course you know as well St. Peter's with an apostrophe S. The architect, again, already I said, was Michelangelo, but look how late it is. It wasn't finished, or it wasn't even totally finished, but it was mostly completed the year he died. He was nearly 90, like 89 in some months. That's really, even now, that's longer than most people live. But in the Renaissance, it was really rare. He made it to just say nearly 90 years old. And this is the last project that was completed, that he completed before he died. He had many unfinished sculptures within the last few years, and they're in museums in Italy, and one's I think actually in France. Anyway, the point is that they're on display, but you can see they're not finished because he was busy with this project. This is what he put on his epitaph. So you could write, that's an important fact. On his epitaph, he wrote his own epitaph at his tomb. It says, Michelangelo, architect of the Dome of St. Peter's. So proving that he was more proud of this than probably anything else he created, although he was very proud of David and many other works. So he became a very, very successful and influential architect. The reason most people give him credit with inspiring every domed building after this is because of this design. At first glance, you might say, so what's so unusual? Well, now we become used to seeing this. And of course, we all saw it on January 6th, right? But it's the model, or you could call it just inspiration for dome buildings all over the world ever since. There's no other way to say that. This became an inspiration for the design of domed buildings around the world ever since it was completed, the year Michelangelo died. Now, some minor changes were done after he died by another architect, but they're so minor, they're not worth mentioning. Why did it become so influential? And why was he so pleased? And what's so different about it? Well, here we go. There are 5 things. And that would be, out of the 6 facts about the meaning, you could write these 5 things and you'd have, if, I'm not saying it will be, but I'm not cutting it, but if it's actually on the midterm, you should have these in your notes. And so here we go. What are the 5 things? Well, we'll start with, it has a tall drum. The drum is the base. The dome actually starts where it curves upwards. You can tell that, I think, right? But these are words you mostly would never have heard. So you just need to write this. The drum, which is from the base to the beginning or bottom of the dome itself. That's called the drum. The drum is unusually tall. So you could just say an unusually tall drum. That's feature number 1 that was different about this dome than any other ever designed before Michelangelo. Okay. Number 2, tall, narrow, paired columns, right? You see them? Tall, narrow, paired columns lining the drum. So that now has become very common. And if you look at a picture of the U.S. Capitol dome, in case you didn't see enough of it during the Senate trial last week, you'll see what we mean. That's very similar. I mean, of course, there are differences. They're not exact copies, these, but the U.S. Capitol and the Sacramento State Capitol and the City Hall in San Francisco were all inspired by this building. Okay, so the second feature again is tall, narrow, you could just say columns, but they're paired. So that creates an upward thrust. See, the whole point of this, underlying these 5 features, why did he use them all together here in one place? To get your eyes to look upwards towards, of course, what? Heaven, obviously. And he knew he was going to die soon. So, in fact, he thought he was going to die when he was in his 50s. He fell off the scaffolding and could have died easily. It didn't break a bone at the Sistine Chapel. He also was nearly crushed by a piece of marble, not the one that he did David, but another big one, possibly the one from, you don't have to write this, for Moses that we just looked at. Anyway, one of the larger pieces of marble that he was supervising, he always went to supervise the, quarrying, right, out of the mountains of Italy. That's where the marble comes from. And he nearly got crushed to death, missed by a few feet. He fell from a crane. They had cranes back then. They would have killed him instantly. So, whatever you can say, there's something going on there with some power beyond pure chance. He survived other things. He had serious infections twice, so bad that his doctors called the priest in to give him last rites. And he survived and got perfectly healthy afterwards and went back to work. It's a pretty remarkable life. There are all kinds of good biographies of him. So anyway, let's do the third feature, okay, which is a tall, narrow dome. Now that might not seem narrow to you, but most domes are much wider proportionately is the point, the height compared to the width. So just say it that way. The third feature was a tall, narrow dome. Then let's look at, here we go. The last 2 features are ribs. Ribs, that's what they're called. They look a lot like ribs, where you see my arrow going. Ribs lining the tall, narrow dome. That again, all it does is it's all combined together. These features make, I'll wait till that says it's the internet, my computer screen says, was unstable, but now it is again. Okay. So these features all combine to make the impression to a viewer of an upward thrusting feeling that makes your eyes go up. Look up towards heaven. Sorry, question. Somebody had a question.
Yeah, did you say rifts with a T or ribs with a B?
No, ribs. Yeah. Sorry, R-I-B. Yeah, R-I-B-S. Yeah. Each one of these is called a rib. And so tall, you can just say, you have to say they're tall. Just say ribs lining They're stone, if you want to say stone ribs, you know, but you don't have to say that. Obviously, this is made out of stone. Ribs lining the tall dome. And then last, an unusually tall cupola. Now, cupola, I believe, is on our terms, list of terms to know. Should be.
Yeah, I think we covered it our first
Yeah.
lecture, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I think we did, yeah. So anyway, it's a room resting on top of a dome, right? Or it can be, yeah, actually, I don't think it's a separate term on your no, it isn't. So you don't, I won't ask you that on the true false part of the test, but for this slide, you should know what it is. It's this structure. It's 35 feet tall. Most cupolas are only, you know, 10, 15, maybe 20 feet tall. So last, fifth and final feature to write is an unusually tall cupola. So you put all those things together, and now let's take a look at the whole thing, and you get the point about the effect of an upward thrusting design. And there's no question this was the inspiration for buildings all over, first in Europe, of course, and then later on it became an inspiration for buildings in North America, even in Hong Kong. I don't know if you've been to Hong Kong or not, but I think a couple of you said you've been to China. When I was in Hong Kong and getting, you know, on a ferry, arriving, I meant to say, on a ferry in the harbor, one of the first buildings you notice is the British Social Club, which is a dome building, and it's very similar, now nowhere near as big as this dome, right at the edge of the harbor from like the 1920s when Hong Kong was a British colony, of course, before it became back in as part of China, right? So in other words, all over the world, you just keep it simple. And now we'll do a formal analysis. There are many, many dome buildings that were inspired by this. And Michelangelo, it just seems to me, don't write this, but you know, how satisfying would that be? You lose the commission you most wanted because he was really just becoming excited as an architect to do more architecture. He lost out to Bramante. Then Bramante dies, and they still don't go and give it to him. They gave it to 3 or 4 other architects who just made a hodgepodge out of they weren't even doing the domes. The building took 75 years to finish, right? Or almost 100. Like most cathedrals. So the front of the building was being done, you'll have to write this, by other architects, not Michelangelo. He designed an entire plan. Of course, he didn't just design a dome sitting by itself in his studio. He had a wooden model of the entire idea. So they never did tap him until he was almost 85 years old. And in the last 10 years, or sorry, 80, I meant 80, the last 10 years of his life, he worked on this as his passion, you know, his passion project. And luckily for him, it was just about finished. There were just a few little details left when he died. So he got to see it. That's pretty satisfying. Okay, formal analysis. Cool white color, except for a little bit of the cupola. There's a tiny little bit of warm, but mostly it's a warm off-white. And of course, it's full of the rhythm of the windows, the columns, the portholes. These are portholes. And of course, even more columns up on the cupola. It's lots of rhythm. It is dynamic. The only thing stable, I would say, are the columns. Everything else is rounded or curved, right? Everything, windows, all of it. So it's mostly dynamic. Of course, it's balanced. It's symmetrical, totally symmetrical, left to right, but unbalanced, obviously wider at the bottom. For space, the dome is 330 feet high. And that makes it the tallest building in Rome. I forgot to mention that. You could add that. You don't have to. It's part of the meaning. And no building is allowed to be taller than it. Even today, the city law ordinance, what are the building codes? Building codes of Rome don't allow any tall. So that's why you don't see a lot of Rome is a metropolitan area of 8 million people. That's pretty big. And they don't have any buildings taller than this dome by law. They're restricted from doing that. So anyway, the point is back to the space aspect. It's real space. Remember, there's no technique. It is one open dome space that is 330 feet tall. I think it's more like 335, but just say over or about 330 feet tall, like a 33-story building would be. Okay, and then we have line is visual line, of course, here around the edges where the sun creates the modeling, of course, is natural. Between the columns and around the edges of these ribs, right? Okay, and then the texture is the real smooth texture of marble, right? And glass in the windows. And let's see, the rhythm, obviously I repeated that. Yeah, I think we got it all. Oh, what's the largest mass? Sorry. It's the dome, I think you would have to say, because if you count this as the drum, it's a close call, but the dome is actually taller than the drum. But you might see it as almost equal, so I leave that to you. And then obviously the third largest, clearly the third largest mass is the cupola. Okay, this is an important painting, and it's by the third of the three. There were three masters of the High Renaissance that every historian agrees were the three greatest painters of the Renaissance, or at least of the High Renaissance. I already defined that term for you last week. And this guy was one of them. So it's a very important slide. Again, you want to take extra careful notes. This is the School of Athens. School of Athens. Raphael, the artist, and I'll spell that, it's Raphael. 1511. This is a fresco on the walls of the library, of the Pope's library. There's a name for it, but it's a long Latin name you don't need to know. So just say the Pope's library, or one of them. There's many, but it's one where he privately would take books if you want to, or meet with scholars or whatever. So this is a fresco on the wall of the Pope's library, which is adjacent to, or you could just say right next to, the Sistine Chapel. That's not a minor detail. It's very important to the meaning of this and to who's in this painting. Why? Because Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel right next door at the same time that Raphael was painting this scene. So that's an important fact about the meaning, the context, where and when it was created. Now, what is it depicting? Well, this is an imaginary gathering of all the greatest scientists, right? And philosophers. That's what they are, scientists and philosophers from ancient Athens. That's why the title is the School of Athens. They lived in different centuries. You know, ancient Greek culture lasted for hundreds of years, of course, before the Romans took them over. So these philosophers didn't all live in the same time or place, but in this imaginary gathering, all of the greatest, I'll say it again, philosophers, right, and artists of ancient Greece, scientists, philosophers, and artists. There we go, all three. Scientists, philosophers, and artists, all the greatest ancient Greek ones. They're supposedly all coming together in one place at one time. Okay, so it's obviously an imaginary scene. But who are they? Well, here we know that this is supposed to be, we have Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle is doubling. You see where my arrow is? This painting has dual identities for some, not all, the figures, one of which is the guy with the white, long, hair and the long white beard. That's the modern, well, modern at the time, say contemporary or Renaissance. You could write either way. Whoops. I'm waiting till the connection is stable again. Repeat that. Okay, once again, the Renaissance identity of the figure with the white hair and long white beard is Da Vinci. It should be obvious. It's a very good portrait of how Da Vinci looked. They all knew each other, by the way, all these artists. The youngest one was Raphael. In fact, he was a good 20 years younger than Michelangelo. Michelangelo was 15 years younger than Da Vinci, but they were all alive at the same time for a while.
Would you classify this painting as a Neoplatonic piece of art?
That's a good question. Excellent question. I don't think we would, because they aren't Christian. None of these figures have Christian identities. If they did, it would be. It's a similar idea. Good point you raised, but I wouldn't use that phrase. Yeah, no, it's just Raphael's own imagination that he's creating this scene, which, by the way, if in case some of you wondered, the building they're supposedly in is the unfinished construction site of St. Peter's. It didn't even have that much finished when he painted it. It was probably only the first level, like up to about here, because these things took decades, these huge cathedrals all over Europe, especially the Gothic cathedrals in the Middle Ages. But even during the Renaissance, when they had a little better technology, they took this building took close to 100 years for it to be finished by Michelangelo. So when he painted this, the building was just beginning to be constructed, but he is imagining how the Cathedral of St. Peter's might look when it's finished. Okay, based on, I don't know what, blueprints, drawings, models, what have you. Talking to Bramante. Guess what? Bramante's in here too. Oh, yeah. And this guy here, then if that's Aristotle, there would probably be Plato next to him. there's some agreement on this. Here we have a sculptor from ancient Greece, and you don't have to know his name, but most historians believe, again, we're not certain of this, but we do know who the Renaissance identity is of the man who is disgusted and dejected. It's Michelangelo, because he didn't want to be forced to paint lying on his back 65 feet above the ground. I told you, he fell once and almost killed himself. So he wasn't happy. The Pope ordered him at the point of a sword, literally arrested him by armed guards and dragged him back to Florence. During the painting of the Sistine Chapel, he actually tried to leave. He was he wasn't paid on time, everything. He was getting sick from the fumes and the dust, and he just got frustrated and left. And the Pope dragged him back, not physically, but his soldiers did. So he was disgusted, and this is a little bit of empathy on the part of Raphael for the unhappy fellow artist next door. Right, he watched Michelangelo paint the Sistine Chapel. When he got a chance, he would sneak in and look at it, at least after Michelangelo finished each day. So they kind of had a grudging respect for each other. So just say it's his statement, the artist Raphael's statement about the unhappy task that Michelangelo had. The other identity is most historians think is a sculptor, ancient Greek sculptor named Myron, who painted sculpted the discus thrower, which you don't have to know. It's a very famous piece of sculpture. The Greeks copied it, and the Romans copied it even more. It's in a lot of museums, copies of it. But the original one was done by, just say, a famous Greek sculptor. And then the Renaissance identity clearly is Michelangelo. And then we have one more where we know the Renaissance identity without debate, and that's Bramante, the architect who at that time was still alive and still working on the first design of St. Peter's. And the other identity is probably either Euclid or one of the other, just say an ancient Greek, you can keep some ancient Greek mathematician or scientist. But the last thing we don't have to guess in is, who is this over here? That's a self-portrait of Raphael. He was a very young man. He was in his 20s when he did this. And then we have this man here. Most historians actually now think this might be Archimedes, or just say a famous scientist. You don't have to know which one of ancient Greece. But if so, there's no agreement on which Renaissance genius or scientist it might be, but nobody debates that this is Bramante, that's Bramante, Michelangelo, and Da Vinci. So you see how he's creating, and some people think this is supposed to be Socrates, but I don't think Socrates would be shown looking like that. It just doesn't look like a very respectful image. The guy looks like he had too much ouzo. Anybody know what that is? Greek wine, yeah. Anyway, so what we have is an imaginary scene. It's very creative, and if you ever look at it, if you're in Florence, you'll see why this was so well received. This painting made Raphael famous all over Europe, at least. You can't say world famous, because people in China didn't know who he was, but all over Europe, he became one of the three most famous painters after he finished this. Already there were Da Vinci and Michelangelo were famous, but Raphael, this painting made his career. He died at 37, by the way. He didn't have a long time to enjoy success. Okay, formal analysis. Balanced? Yes, completely. Totally symmetrical. These two figures are in the middle, and they're, between almost an equal number of bodies on either side. And then we've got this group here. Yeah, it's very carefully balanced. And I would call it balanced top to bottom and left to right, too. The floor and the stairs balance the ceiling and the arch. Yeah, it is balanced both ways. The cement texture, of course, it's superb. And on the walls, on the clothing, on the hair, on the steps and floor below everyone. And of course, there's the rhythm of the arches, the sculpture, and the human figures, powerful rhythms. And then we have the modeling is strong and realistic. It's faded a bit, after all, it's 500 years old. So, of course, it might not seem as sharp, but, if you're there, you'll see. It's been restored, too, recently, by the way. I think this is done after the restoration. It's strong and realistic modeling and cement texture. It is both stable on the human figures and the stairs and floor. I guess you could even say the corners, but obviously the ceilings on the imaginary church they're in, or cathedral, and this whole archway are dynamic, but it's, I'd say, more stable than dynamic. if you look at the different parts. The largest mass, that's up to you to decide. I mean, you could say it's the big archway above it, because this is all part of the painting, by the way, which we don't usually talk about these because I've never seen a picture that shows those details clearly. But the floor could be the largest mass. I would consider, if you count the stairs and the floor as one mass. So you can decide. And then if you look at the human figures, this is almost one single group here. They're all overlapping. So you could call that the largest, third largest mass, I mean. And then there's two groups here, if you look at it that way. And every line here is bold around the human figures and thin around the setting or the background, the building. That's typical of Raphael. He combined some of the thin outlines of other artists and the bold outlines of Michelangelo, which he clearly was inspired to do. Then we have the warm colors, obviously, on some of the robes here. You know, Da Vinci here has got warm colored robes, and Plato / question mark, we don't know what Renaissance figure is. Blue would be the cool, of course, you can see. Then the building around them is mostly cool colors. And then for space, you have all the techniques except atmospheric perspective, or at least I don't see atmospheric perspective. That was a clouds. You don't see a horizon, but there is a vanishing point behind these two figures and between roughly where they would be, if you could see the horizon behind their shoulders. So there's scientific perspective, overlapping, foreshortening, obviously, on the floor and the stairs, and diminishing size. Okay. By the way, I've had people say, isn't there a register line because of the steps? No, there's not a line here painted. That's actually a scene with a realistic depiction of a building interior where there's, you know, stairs. So you can't really call that. You could make the case that it has the effect if you really want to stretch things, and I wouldn't argue with that. Because, you know, obviously the figure here, this guy's closer to us than these two, and they're on the top step. But that wasn't his intention, but you could make the case that it has the same visual effect. Okay, boy, here's a controversial painting, and it has to do with sin. We're going to see more than one of those tonight. After the break, we'll see the most famous painting of human sinful behavior after the break, and that will be the Garden of Earthly Delights. But this one is in that ballpark. It's Bacchanal is the title. Baccanal. Again, Baccanal. Bacchanal, one word. The artist's name is Titian. Titian. Titian the Venetian, I call him. You don't have to use that phrase, but it happens to be a way I used to remember him when I had art history at UC Berkeley, because he's the first famous Renaissance painter from Venice. And Venice wasn't known to have a lot of famous, very successful painters in the early Renaissance, but the high Renaissance and later they did. So just say Titian was from Venice. You don't have to say Titian the Venetian, but you could if you want to. And the date is 1513. So what have we got here? Okay, let's see. Is there somebody trying to get in? I can't tell. No, I don't think so. Yeah, okay. I was just looking to make sure. All right, so if there are questions that are on there, we'll look at them during the break if they're chat questions, or you can ask them orally before we start the second half after the break. So let's do 2 more slides and then take a break. We'll be just about the right amount of time. Okay, so what have we got? We've got a scene which the title should tell you if you don't know who Bacchus was. He was the ancient Roman god of wine and debauchery, or you could say wine and partying if you want to. I think that word's perfectly acceptable, even if it's a modern way of looking at debauchery used to mean, you know, drunken orgies. So Bacchus was in the painting was named for the ancient Roman god Bacchus, who was the god of wine and partying, or wine and debauchery. So what's going on here besides drinking? Well, let's get up close. This guy, you've heard of being tipsy? Quite literally, this guy is almost ready to maybe crash on his own forehead a glass pitcher full of wine. This is, of course, wine being poured. Then we have this woman here. I mean, she's not even looking. It's almost like she just says, hit me again. I don't care what you're pouring, I'll drink it. I mean, you can see the point here is people aren't paying attention to their own, quote, sinful, unquote, behavior. Is it sinful? Of course, each person would have their own perspective, but in the terms of the Catholic Church, back at this time in history, it would have been not just getting drunk, but what happens to the people once they are drunk. Like, look at this guy, blotto. You've heard that word? He's obviously had way too much to drink. And then we get to the two most controversial figures. This here, there's a debate over, but I've now, students have convinced me over the years with enough arguing in class, but we aren't going to do that tonight, I'm sure, that this is not two women dancing with each other, even though this figure is clearly wearing a dress. So the other interpretation, it is a man acting like a woman and having, of course, a non-marital, right, intimacy, which he will then pair off with her if it's a man. So just say there's two theories. Could be two women who are going to have intimate relations because they're drunk, or just because it's a sin and they want to break that taboo, which clearly would have been an extremely bad thing for the Catholic Church. They would have tried to arrest anyone. Of course, they did often, and torture them if they were caught doing that. Or the other theory is that the figure in the orange silk, and they're both wearing, it looks like, or at least the orange one is silk or satin, is a man dressed up like a woman. And that itself would also be considered, taboo by the Catholic Church. And either way, they're not married, so they're going to get. But the worst thing of all, the worst sin, according, and I think this isn't even about whether, you're looking at it as, say, the older Catholic religious figures would have. It's just a tragedy happening. This mother is so out of it that she's not even paying attention to her poor baby she brought with her, who is being soaked. You can see that in alcohol. That's what you call an early ticket to alcoholism. Obviously, that's beyond irresponsible. It would be considered sinful behavior, even maybe in modern times. In any case, no one here is paying attention to the consequences of their actions, and therefore they're drunk and they're debauched, right? They're engaging in sinful behavior. According to the Catholic Church at that time, this would have been a very powerful image of what you shouldn't do, okay? And that's the intention of Titian. He's painted this with that in mind. Okay, the formal analysis. It's unbalanced toward the bottom, and because of the sky in the upper half, clearly weighted towards the bottom, but it is roughly balanced left to right. I would say that this hill and this tree, well, you can make the case that tree makes it look balanced, unbalanced toward the left. But I just feel that the human figures balance it that way. And then you've got a hill and clouds. It seems roughly balanced to me. Depends on how you look at that, left to right, but not top to bottom. There's the rhythm, of course. Some of the stuff by now you guys can already do, which you should be starting to write your papers. So hopefully you're already doing this. On rhythm, it's so full of rhythm, of course, with the arms, hands, legs, heads, pitchers of wine, and so forth. And then it's good, strong symmetric texture. You can just almost always absolutely count on that being true for any Renaissance painting. On the clothing, the hair, the skin, and of course the landscape, and even the clouds. And then we have the modeling. It's very strong, even in the sky on the clouds. He was one of the first painters to focus his attention on the realistic details of clouds. The modeling and the cement texture are very realistic on the skyscape as well as the landscape, and of course all the human figures. All the lines here are thin outlines. The largest mass, well, it depends. If you want to count the sky as one mass, that would be the largest. If you don't look at it that way, then you could say this hill, if you look at it as one mass, or these, well, actually it looks like two trees that overlap. So you could say this group of trees. And then it would be the drunken mother in the foreground among the human figures. For space, you have here all the techniques overlapping. Yeah, I think I have, and I do. In fact, let me do this. I have another image of it. Whoops. Let's go see a close-up of it. Yeah, look, I took this slide at the museum. It's in Prado in Madrid. It's one of the three greatest museums of art in, some would say the world, I would certainly say, but at least in Europe. Obviously, they are in order: the Louvre, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, which used to be Leningrad. In size, they're also, and then third would be the one in Madrid. That's where this is, in the Prado in Madrid. You see there's atmospheric perspective here. And there's obviously overlapping, diminishing size, right, of the figures. I'm going to go back to the full view. Whoops, didn't mean to go quite that far back. And then there is foreshortening on, the hill and at least some of the human figures like the drunken mother. So foreshortening, overlapping, diminishing size, atmospheric perspective, and obviously there is scientific perspective. Very few Renaissance paintings that show landscape didn't use scientific perspective. There is a vanishing point behind the boat here. Okay, the colors are mostly warm on the human figures and their skin, and then a mixture of warm and cool on the clothing, right? And the sky is cool, of course, and the landscape is mostly warm. Okay, and it is almost entirely dynamic. The only things I see stable are maybe even the tree trunks are curved a bit, but maybe a little bit the trees. Otherwise, everything else is curved. Okay, then we're going to go to the next. Whoops, I need to do that. Yeah, hang on. Let's see. We've got one more must know here I want to get to before the break. Oh, I know what. That's right. It's such a large file that I broke it into 2 files. So why don't we go ahead and call it, it's almost 7:50. Let's go ahead and take a slightly earlier break, which probably means we can end at least 10 minutes early, but we don't go away unless you are wanting to risk not getting as good a grade as you otherwise would on the midterm, because we're going to cover some pretty earthy, the Garden of Earthly Delights. Some of you have seen it. There's some behavior in that will shock even some of the most open-minded of you. I'll tell you why when you see it. And then we'll cut at least one more probably before we finish. But we still have at least 5, maybe 6 more to do. And so we still should be able to end early. Let's call it a 15-minute break. Okay, and it's almost 7:50, so we'll say 10 minutes to 8 till 8:05. All right, I'll see you all at 8:05. I'm going to pause the recording here. All right, recording, there we go. Okay, I want to make sure everybody can hear me. Why is this doing this? There it goes. Okay, can everybody hear me? Hello? Okay, good. Good. Yeah, this is a really important painting, and it's one of the most juicy is the word one of my students used about it. What's going on in it is beyond controversial. It's sinful. There we go. And there's a lot to explain, and I will do it in a tasteful manner, but there's no getting around that this is all about all of the most extreme sinful behavior known to European culture in this period are depicted. All the major sins are depicted in this. Okay, this is the next must know. It's the Garden of Earthly Delights. The Garden of Earthly Delights, and the artist's name is Bosch, B-O-S-C-H. His last name, B-O-S-C-H, 1515. You probably, some of you have seen this, or at least had, maybe a fleeting impression of what's going on here, but we're going to go into some detail. Okay, so this is a triptych. Remember what that is. We covered that the first week of class, or second week. A painting with 3 panels, one large central panel and 2 hinged side panels. So let's talk about what's going on in each panel. Now, this is often called mannerist, and let me see, I think that is a definition I need to give you, and if it is a short one, not a long definition. Yeah, mannerism. Mannerism is the last part of tonight's topic, the main, movement. It's a period of late, here we go, I'll repeat this, say it slowly and repeat it. Mannerism is a period of late Renaissance art from 1520 to 1600. Those are approximate. So you don't have to write a little c, but there's no exact dates here, but just say from about 1520 to 1600, comma, during which artists created their own unique and exaggerated techniques, during which artists created their own unique and exaggerated techniques. Well, that certainly fits this painting, that definition. we'll see why as we go into the details. Okay, everybody got that definition? Okay, all right, let's start with the first panel, and I don't have to do a one of those other formal close-ups because I took several slides of this. Whoops, whoa, it jumped. There we go. This panel here, I am going to do a close-up though, is called the Eden panel, the Garden of Eden panel. So the Garden of Earthly Delight sounds innocent, doesn't? Oh, everything's fine. No, it starts out that way. But even here, there's sinfulness going on. So we'll start with the fact that Jesus is the man here, if it's not obvious, with the beard and the long hair in the robes. And this is Adam and Eve. Well, they're in the Garden of Eden, and if you didn't already know this, you need to write it, that they're about to engage in that sinful behavior called sex. There's no other way to put it. And the symbolism here tells us that they were about to do that. And the symbolism is in the bottom part of this painting, the bottom part of this panel. Remember, it's 3 panels, so we're going to discuss what's going on in each panel. It's a tree with phallic symbols, a tree full of phallic symbols. That right there is a little bit unusual and even some would say shocking at that time, at least, if not by today's standards, that the artist is portraying the male sex organ as branches of a tree, which he's implying is about to be used for sinful behavior, i.e. intercourse, of course. And Jesus is telling them, don't do it. See, his hand is raised. He's warning them, don't do that. It's a sin and you'll be punished. But did they listen? According to the Bible, no, of course. But down here is something even more controversial, and I just want to be, circumspect is the word, not direct about what that is. It's the female counterpart of the male sex organ depicted as a filthy cesspool. Well, you can do the math there. What the artist is saying is that for outside of a marriage to create children, according to the Catholic Church, of course, they're the ones that would have judged this painting, obviously. This would have been, forbidden to men or anyone else, anybody to partake of the intimate activity in such a portion of a female anatomy, because you're only supposed to do it when you're married and only to procreate, only to have children. So it's a cesspool of sin, symbolic of the female sex organ, nearby the tree full of the, of course, male sex organs or phallic symbols. And then we have this here. Most historians, we'll just say many, you can't say most. Nobody knows for sure, but there's a face. Can you see the face here, right? With a weird looking nose and mouth and 2 eyes. So it's some kind of demon-like creature disguised as a fountain or acting as a fountain. And it's resting on a sea of, we don't know, but I think it's Russian caviar. They had Russian caviar, and that's a sign of sinfulness. You're so rich you can afford to import. You had to be super rich back then. Now, of course, you can get it in markets all over the world. But back then, only a few very wealthy people, and usually for parties, and those parties were often full of sinful behavior, would even have access or have the option of having caviar. So we don't know if that's it. Just say some historians believe that is a mountain or mound, whatever you want to say, of caviar upon which a sinful, wicked, demonic creature is of course enticing the Adam and Eve figures down below to, just party and ignore the rules against that behavior. Okay. Whoops, I forgot I always have to do it this way. Let's move on now.
So it's standing on a mountain of what?
Caviar. That's one theory. There's no proof of that. It sure looks like caviar to me. If you've ever seen Russian caviar, it has a distinct look, right? Black. You know what caviar is. If you don't, then you can look it up. We have to keep moving. Yeah, and so only very super rich, just extremely rich people could afford it, and they usually use it at parties where sinful behavior ensued, right? Now there isn't any ambiguity about what's going on in this scene, or this section in the middle is called the Orgy Panel. I'll back up and you'll see what I mean. Just so, see, this whole panel is the main event here. It's depicting all the sins that were known to European society or culture, you can say it either way, at that time. We start with a man riding on the back of a bird and getting excited. So that's bestiality. Okay, you get the, we're just getting started. Look what he's got on his head, a giant condom. Yes, they had condoms back then. It's rather modern looking, but that's what that is. So a man wearing a giant condom over his head is having, pleasurable experience with a giant bird. Well, it gets weirder. This man is having carnal knowledge of a bush. So I don't know what you'd call that. If the other thing with the animals is bestiality, maybe this is bushiality. I don't, there's no word for it. It's just bizarre how this guy came up with these. There's a theory how the artist Bosch even thought of these things. There's a debate on that. And I think I know the answer, but we'll get to that at the end. Here we have another sin, a white man and a black woman. Oh, how terrible, right? That would have definitely been against the rules of that time and place, the strict teachings of Christianity, quote unquote, isn't Christianity so much as the Catholic Church itself. Never mind that in the Holy Land, quote unquote, right, where Jesus came from, there were all kinds of interracial relationships, right? But not supposed to happen. It's sinful. And of course, they're probably not married, so that makes it a double sin. Then we have necrophilia. These are dead people. That man's flesh has already turned greenish blue. So these three are somehow engaging in, well, the grapes would be symbolic of course, alcohol consumption, right? But they're dead. So they're having some kind of a orgiastic, or let's just say, sinful interaction with each other while drunk, even though they're dead. I mean, it gets weirder. And then we have two women. There's no debating that's what this is. There's no saying one of them's a man or a man disguised as a woman. These are two women knowing carnal knowledge of each other. And that, of course, is a big sin. And then we have an orgy, a group sex scene here of people engaging in some kind of, let's just say, release on the backs of llamas. Now, llamas had barely been known. Well, I don't know if they're all llamas, but that sure looks like a llama. South America wasn't even technically discovered then. So some people think he had a vision of the future, and I'll explain that in one of the next panels. Okay, so here we go. That's about half of it. Then we get to this section where all hell breaks loose, quote unquote. You can use that phrase. Quite literally, these are the worst of the worst of all the sins that he depicts. Here's drug addiction and abuse. The strawberry and the poppy are symbolic of drugs, which of course are extremely addictive and intoxicating. Then we have, anybody knows what I mean by this, the Richard Gere effect. I'm sorry. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there was a myth about Richard Gere, the actor. Supposedly, I can't go into detail, but obviously these two men are engaging in behavior that the Catholic Church would not look kindly on, right? With this bush here and this.
Yeah.
You can put that mildly, yeah. Then we have women, or at least it looks like three women, or maybe it's one woman and two men. And the woman is carrying a fish and she's inviting, it could be two men. I can't go there, but some of you know what I'm getting at without my getting too graphic. It's a metaphor for a certain aspect of a soon to be consummated sex act between a woman and I guess it probably two men. Then we have another giant condom. Look at this over the heads of a threesome. They're about to engage. That right there is a sin. And then we have these are women giving away their cherries. Okay, I don't want to get more. You see how this guy really was out there, is the word some people would use, extreme in his depiction of sinful behavior. And an owl was symbolic of evil and the knowledge of evil, according to Renaissance. Let's see, I do have a detail of it. And then look at this, a young woman looking intently. Look at her face. Look how modern looking that expression is, or at least the pose. And her maybe male, we can't tell, or female future partner has a giant olive for a head. I don't know what that means. But my favorite detail of all of this, I think, is this area here where the detail down below is a self-portrait of Bosch, and he's pointing to one of those plastic riot shields. You see them on the streets of Burma now, by the way, and you saw them this summer, right, during the protests over Black Lives Matter, as also in Europe, you see it. in Belarus, right? Anywhere that there are a large number of policemen that use plastic shields, they didn't have plastics. That's why some historians think this guy did, maybe he talked to Nostradamus, don't write that. Well, you could if you want to. There's no certain explanation for how he visualized some of these details, unless he experienced them or had a vision of them. So my leading theory, or the leading theory that I believe in, is that he engaged in every one of these sex. Oh, by the way, here's another interracial between two women, right? That's even worse. A black woman and a white woman. And these apparently are waiting in the wings to join. Every little detail here is something going on, sinful behavior. I mean, it's really right out in your face. So this painting was controversial, but how did he get away with it? Because he explained it with the last panel. This is the Damnation Panel, the third part of the triptych. And here we have, let's go up close to this part, a giant phallic symbol in the form of two huge ears and a knife, which is literally cutting males in the two, right through the middle of their groin, because these are the sins being punished with the appropriate punishment in hell for eternity. I'll say it again. This scene depicts what happens to those sinners in that last panel. After they die and go to hell, they will be punished appropriately by, well, you could say God or the devil, either one. Just say in hell, with a punishment that fits their sin, because it fits the crime, if you want. And one of those, we don't know what all these things mean, but we do know what this is for men who misuse their private parts, meaning, had extramarital sex or premarital sex, or otherwise were, not in a loving, committed relationship when they had intimate affairs, and so they're being punished by having their genitals sliced in half, which is pretty extreme. This half, I forgot about this, the upper portions, about a third, shows what happens to soldiers who commit sins during wartime, that rape, pillage, burn, torture, kidnap innocent civilians in the cities that they took. Of course, that was a normal behavior for armies back then. And this artist is saying, Bosch, by the way, he was Dutch. He wasn't from Italy, but at that time it was still all under the Catholic Church. All of Western Europe was still Catholic then. So what we see here is him depicting the devil's armies torturing in seas of burning, fire like lakes, or lakes of fire, and in buildings that are collapsing around them. All of the things that these soldiers had done in their lifetime to harm innocent civilians, which were sinful, of course, at least officially they were, even if a lot of soldiers did those things. They're being punished for it by being subjected to the same behavior by the devil's own armies. Then we have what looks like a portion of bagpipes. Well, it is. There's a word for it. You don't have to know it. It's sackbuts. That's the word for a precursor of bagpipes. Bagpipes hadn't quite been invented this far back. But if you've ever had to listen to bagpipes, hey, I have Scottish heritage. It's one half of my heritage. So I can say this. I'm not dissing my own culture, but it's hard to listen to bagpipes for hours and hours on end, let alone for eternity. So these are musicians who were sinful by definition, according to the Catholic Church. If you did any other music besides what the church itself sanctioned, especially at a party where people were going to engage in sexual behavior, you were enticing people to commit sin, and therefore you, the musician, were guilty of participating in sin. So these musicians are being forced to listen to the music that they play, perhaps with those instruments. Oh, there's just all kinds. So down here at the bottom, let's get to this one. We see, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I think it's one more view I have. Yeah, gluttony being punished. Gluttony is being punished in the form of a giant demonic frog. That's what it looks like to me, half human, half frog, devouring someone just the way gluttons devour everything they can get their hands on. And then he's literally digesting and shatting them out through his bowels. It's just, you get the idea. Oh, and then here is a musician being tortured for having played bad music. All his, perhaps, or sinful music anyway. It should probably say sinful music, whatever, at a party, or for the king, and or for his girlfriend, or for his mistresses, whatever. and he's being tortured by being punctured right through part of his anatomy and having to listen again to the same thing here. This musician, apparently someone didn't like harp music. I guess that's the point here, and felt they were being tortured. So now this guy's being tortured. It looks like a man, right? For eternity by having to listen to being strung up or hung up on a harp and then having to listen to this music from hell for eternity. So, and nobody can explain how this guy got on this. Look at this. What is that? It looks like something out of, let's see, Lake Shasta or something. Somebody, one of those, small little craft. What do they call them? I can't even remember. Hovercraft. No, so anyway, you know what I'm saying. There are things in this painting no one can explain. And how did he know these things when they seem to be ahead of their time? Some of the details, not most of them. Anyway, what we can identify, we know, are different depictions of sinful behavior. But finally, he got away with this painting and was not called by the Catholic Church, to the Inquisition because of it. He wasn't. He could have been, because even though they're not in Italy, they had power over Holland at that time. It was still at the Catholic kingdom or duchy, whatever it was. The point is, he could have been forced to go and explain himself, but he wasn't, because he said this is a sermon in paint on wood. Of course, it's painted on wood. All triptychs are on wood, right? It's also at the Prado in Madrid, by the way. Well worth the trip to that museum for this alone, but there's so many great paintings there. So this painting was meant to portray not only the sins themselves, but the punishment that you will have if you don't repent. And yet, when I look at this image of him, I don't know about the rest of you, but I think he's saying, yeah, I did this and I enjoyed it. But now I'm repenting. It's one of those things. No one can say for sure. Why is there a smirk, a self-satisfied smirk on the face of the self-portrait of the artist? No one knows for sure, but I think it's because he engaged in almost all these activities at some point in his life before painting this. Infamous, right? It's controversial, scandalous, whatever word you want to use. It caused scandal at the time, but the painter was not punished because he said, I'm just warning people not to do this. Okay, formal analysis. It's pretty straightforward. Let's go back to the full view, which is this. It has, of course, balance. I mean, really, it's obviously balance. Although some people think because they see more of these figures, the human figures conducting sinful behaviors below the midline, that it's unbalanced toward the top. But I think these objects here, all these strange looking objects that look like World War II mines, or maybe World War I mines, that floated in the ocean and that still are floating around out there. I know someone in Finland who lost an eye from one of those, who was my age, and when she was a kid, she actually picked one up, or a small one, and it exploded. Luckily, it didn't kill her. Yeah, so what is that? We don't know. Just say the objects above the midline, it depends on how you look at it. I think they make it balanced, top to bottom. Clearly, it's balanced, all three panels, left to right. He's arranging the figures that way. But here you might say, oh, this looks like it's empty space, but it isn't. We just looked at it. It's full of collapsing, burning buildings and soldiers. So I think they're balanced, all three panels, both ways. Anyway, we have the rhythm, obviously huge amount of rhythm with all the repeated animals and human bodies and strange objects in each panel. And here it's, it looks like somebody's saying, oh, this must be Noah's Ark about to happen. Maybe, but where's the boat and where's Noah? I don't think so. I think it's just supposed to be animals walking around the Garden of Eden before they become, or before Adam and Eve become condemned by God to leave, right, for their sin. Okay, and then we have dynamic. I don't see a stable thing in this. I mean, maybe the top part of this fountain, okay, and the bottom or trunk of this tree. I guess Jesus is. So there are a few dynamic details, but look carefully, especially in the central panel. Everything's curved, dynamic, in motion. There's very little, if anything, that's stable. Maybe a part of some of the objects in the background. Even more so here, except maybe this musical instrument, possibly. But everything else, even the harp, is at a diagonal. Okay, and then we have the space techniques. All of the main techniques are here. Atmospheric perspective, absolutely. In the distance, you see it on the horizon. There is a vanishing point, so it's got scientific perspective, as do all three, because they all have horizons, all three panels. And then we have, of course, diminishing size, overlapping, and foreshortening on some of the objects here. and on the landscape itself. Thin outline on all the figures, super sharp, realistic simulated textures on the skin, the hair, and the strange optics and the landscape. Strong, again, sharp modeling, again, on all the same things. And then we have, let's see, colors, well, mostly warm on the bodies, of course. And I think I'd say warm on the landscape. It's a yellowish kind of a cast to the grass here. It doesn't look as green as grass usually does. But the very back edges of the landscapes here are, of course, cool, as are the pools. And of course, there's some cool colors in the foreground on some of the objects here. And here it's about the same. There's cool on that strange looking half destroyed. What is it? Nobody knows what this is. Something that's
I was gonna ask about that actually.
Yeah. There's no consensus on what this is. Dali was inspired by this painting. If that doesn't surprise you, then you haven't seen any Dalis. If that surprises you, I mean, Dali looked at this painting. It was, after all, he's from Spain. He would go look at it, and when he got ideas, he didn't copy any of it. He had his own creative imagination. But Salvador Dali, right? So some people call this the 400-year advanced, ahead of its time, first version of a surrealistic painting. But we really just call it Mannerist because of the bizarre, exaggerated details that you see everywhere. Okay, I think that's it on this. Let's move on now. You see why I said that's controversial. You get the idea. This would be embarrassing on the red paper, huh? Okay, this next one also has some controversy, but for very different reasons.
Yeah, wait. And just to go back to that last one, I don't know about you, but that's yeah, but that kind of seems like felt more like a comic strip. Don't you think?
Well, there is a sense of sardonic humor to it. I think the artist was trying to show off that he, and which is his way of
being more of a
little bit humorous in a way. Oh, someone needs to be admitted. Hang on. Sorry. Hi, welcome. I hope you just were joining us. Yeah, that painting has so many different levels of meaning, but I gave you the most important ones you need to know for the exam. So you could easily, of course, look up articles about it, and that's extra credit, 5 points, a pop, or you could write a paper about it if you want to, either of your papers. Okay, let's move on. This one is, the next must know is Crucifixion, Eisenheim Altarpiece. Sorry, 3 words. Crucifixion is CRUCIFIXION, the crucifixion of Jesus, of course. Eisenheim's a city in Germany. ISENHEIM. Altarpiece is one word, Altarpiece. The artist's name was Grunewald or Grunwald. I usually pronounce it with the E. The Germans would say Grunewald. He was German. GRUNEWALD, Grunewald. 1515. So what are we looking at here? It's not a triptych. Start with that. It's a multi-panel altarpiece for a church. But look, there's 4 panels right here. So it should be obvious it's not a triptych. So if you wrote that it was a triptych, you'd get a couple points off because it's not. It's a multi-paneled church altarpiece. And it was painted just before the break of Protestants with Martin Luther, of course, was the one, right? He was from Germany, as you should know, broke with the Catholic Church and started the Protestant religion. Just before that, why is that an important detail? Because Germany was seething with revolt. Germany was the people of Germany, the priests and the local politicians, most of the population, except for the cardinals who were appointed in Rome, right? So almost everyone, from the lower classes to the upper class, they were angry with the Catholic Church for being so corrupt and taking money away from them, from their taxes and using it for what they considered corrupt, self-promoting things like, parties, what have you, in living lavish lifestyles. Many of them were, not all the popes, but many of them were. So at that time. So what do we see here? We see a painting that is a kind of a protest, but it's not about so much the Catholic Church as it is about the story of Jesus's death. The crucifixion means when he was crucified, of course, on the cross. So at first glance, we're only going to look at the central panel. You don't have to know what the other three panels are. That's too much detail. But actually, wait a minute. I forgot. I have a better view of it. Yeah, there we go. It's the next slide. There we go. What's going on in the central panel is controversial and was scandalous. The Catholic Church hated this painting and wanted it removed, if not destroyed, removed from the church where it was commissioned, of course, by a local bishop, probably. Just say a church in Germany commissioned it, and the Catholic officials hated it for the three reasons. It broke three taboos or three rules of the Catholic Church. Let's see if you can guess what those were. Let's start with Jesus's body. What do you notice about his flesh? It's very different the way it's depicted here than in any other crucifixion painting before.
Necrosis has set in. It's
yes. Say that again.
Old.
Yeah, go ahead. Say it again.
2 days old, if I'm having to guess. Maybe just right before the third day when he rose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you used a good phrase. I forget the word for what's happening to his flesh.
Necrosis.
Necrosis or putrefaction or decay. You can use any of those words. Yeah, it shows his skin as literally beginning to decay. And that is a sin right there, because according to the Bible, he was not going to ever, during that whole time he was crucified and after where he supposedly rose his body out of his tomb, it was perfect, right? Except for the holes where the nails were, of course. So that is a contrary, you can say contradiction is a better word, a contradiction or rejection, either word will do, of the teaching of the Catholic Church that Jesus' body remained, perfect or pure. It's what would happen to a normal human being if they were treated, their body was treated this way. They would begin to have some early stages of decay. So that would have been the first and most obvious taboo or breaking of a rule, of a traditional rule that the Catholic Church would object to. But there's a couple more. Okay, let's look at his fingers here. Actually, I meant to stay up on that. Look what's happening to his hands and his fingers. Does anybody know what that could indicate? I mean, there's no absolute right or wrong here. Just what does it look like?
Have they gone stiff?
Well, sort of, but you see the pose or position, that they're in, which means before, if they are stiff, that would be rigor mortis, of course. You don't have to write that, but something has to do with something that Jesus must have, right before he died, then been doing with his hands, and that you just never see in any other crucifixion. Well, okay, if you had a nail run right, put right through the palm of your hand and forcing you to, hang from that, how would your body react?
He looks like he's in pain.
Yeah, perfect, excellent. You guys are right on the nose here. Yes, he is being depicted as writhing, with a W, writhing in pain. Again, a very bad thing according to the Catholic Church. You don't show Jesus, so he quietly endured this according to their interpretation of the Bible. By the way, most of you know the Bible was written. I went to catechism, so I can talk about this. It's just a quick aside. Don't write this. Very brief. 20, 30 seconds. The Bible was written anywhere from 60 to 300 years after Jesus died. Now, there were a few people who worked on it who were young enough to have been disciples of his, but most of them were not alive when he was alive. So how do we know? What we know is what the Romans wrote about. We know that's what they did to him. He did live, and he probably showed pain. In any case, this artist is the first, or this painting is, put it that way. Now you should be writing again notes on me. This is the first painting to depict Jesus in obvious pain. Another violation, if you want to call it that, or breaking of the rules of the Catholic Church. The final thing might surprise some of you. Look where his feet are. Of course, the blood is a little bit part of it, but it's mostly the location. This is the ground. Does anybody know why that would be controversial? You see where his feet are in relation to the ground? Is that the way Jesus usually shown when he's shown in a crucifixion? No, he's usually up high above eye level. You're looking up at him, right? And the cross is a good 6 feet before you get to the bottom of his feet, 6 feet, tall. And so his feet are nearly dragging in the dirt. Oh, that might have been in a way the most objectionable thing, because again, it shows him down on a human level with everyday people who, if they were treated this way, is how they would react. Their body would rot. Their body before they died would be writhing in pain, and they might easily be, further down on a cross. But I don't know, it's true the Romans usually did put people up higher up on a cross. But all of those three things put together made this painting extremely offensive to Catholic officials, the Catholic Church, you could just say. And they tried to get it removed, but the people in that town refused to let the Catholic Church take the painting away. They were that powerfully, opposed to the Catholic Church. And then you can even add this. This is Mary. Look, she's wearing rags. Think about it. Probably is more realistic. She lived a life of almost homelessness in the streets, following occasionally where her son went, but not literally with him all the time, but following him maybe, from one town to another. And of course, she had no income or anything, so she probably was dressed in rags during the latter part of her life, but no one ever depicted her that way. This painting on so many levels. So now you actually have 4 different things you could mention if it's on the exam. I'm not saying I won't cut it or will, but it could be on the midterm. You can see why the Catholic officials, you can say the hierarchy or Catholic rulers were really upset by this. And they tried to get the painting removed from view from the public, but they couldn't. And then the last part of the meaning is, this is John the Baptist. This is Jesus' spirit, how he'll come back to earth, many, many centuries, supposedly, whatever, millenniums, many, many, many years later, he'll return disguised as a sheep. That's what it says in the Bible. So this is the Holy Spirit of Jesus that'll come back later. I don't know how a sheep carries the cross, but somehow he is. And then here we have above Mary, the other Mary, Mary Magdalene, and one of the other disciples. We don't know which one. Okay, formal analysis. I think this uses a hint of atmospheric perspective, because that's the hillsides behind them. There's a canyon behind where Jesus, we know the Romans kept good records. We don't have to guess. Part of the landscape, the area around Jerusalem where they did their crucifixions, we know the records still exist in some form of how and where the Romans did these things to anyone convicted of being a threat to the Roman Empire. So what we see here is that just lights, but it's just an open canyon, so it wouldn't be houses and buildings with lights on them. Plus, which this is before most people would have anything but candles right at night. So I think it's a kind of atmospheric perspective, but you could argue that all it has, if that doesn't look obvious, is scientific perspective, because obviously there is a horizon here, dark though it is, overlapping, foreshortening, of course, on the hill, and to some degree on the shoulders of these figures. Foreshortening, overlapping, and scientific perspective. I don't see diminishing size here. Don't think there is. The lines around the edges, the outlines are all thin. The simian texture, including on Jesus's rotting flesh, is quite realistic. In fact, I've had some students say, now that's his crown of thorns, but I had one student think it looked like dreads, but no, I don't think so. But all the detail, the cross, the wood on the cross itself, all of it is very realistic. Mary's rags that she's barely able to keep on her shoulders. And of course, the hair and skin of the living human figures. That's all very sharply realistic, as is all the modeling. The largest mass, that's easy, Jesus. And then it depends on how you break it up. Maybe these 2 figures, if you count them as one mass, then John the Baptist, and then I guess Mary, because she's kneeling. And then dynamic or stable, it's mostly stable. Jesus's body, except for his 2 arms, but even then, it's only because they're nailed, but the cross is clearly stable. His body is almost entirely. And these figures the human figures are mostly upright. There's a slight dynamic tilt to the upper half of Mary Magdalene, but mostly it's stable. And let's see, balanced. Well, that most people think it's weighted slightly or somewhat to the left, and definitely weighted toward the bottom, of course. And the rhythm is obvious with the human body's parts, arms, hands, legs. And the colors are mostly warm, except on Mary Magdalene's white gowns and the sheep there. Or lamb, they call lamb, baby sheep. Almost all the rest of the clothing and all the skin is warm. Now we get to an artist that I'll bet many of you haven't even heard of, or if you have, you might not know some of the things about him. So we're going to work up to the must know, which will, I'll give you the title, be in about 4 or 5 minutes when we get to the actual must know. This is not that. This is a self-portrait of the artist Dürer, his name was. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the title so you have it ready to just start inserting your notes for the meaning. All right, let me give you the title of the must know. It's about 3 slides from this. Melancholia, Melancholia, Melancholia. Melancholia 1. He did a series of those, or no, he didn't. He never finished it, but he intended to. So he labeled the first one. It's not this painting, like I said. It's not even a painting, it's an engraving. The artist's name, you definitely want to know who he was because he's so ahead of his time, centuries ahead of his time. Dürer, he was German. Some of you can tell by the spelling of that last name. D-U-R-E-R, Dürer, 1514. This is a self-portrait. I took this slide. It's at the Louvre. And it was when he was in his 20s. And he was, and you can tell by the way he's dressed. So I usually ask people, but I want to, well, let me go ahead and ask. What do you think? Let's get a little closer view. You could tell about his social standing from this in terms of, or his economic status. I know some people look at it and they get the opposite impression of what he really was in terms of where his financial situation was. But I could give you a clue, a hint. Go ahead, please, go ahead.
Judging by the clothing, it seems that he was rich, but not that rich.
Well, that's a good guess.
The reason I say that is because of that, in particular, the folds over his cloak on his left shoulder, and the excess of fabric along his shirt. Clothing like that wouldn't be necessarily of the cheapest variety, but he isn't. None of his clothing is embroidered. He isn't wearing a whole lot of layers. So I would say maybe upper middle class.
Good point.
Yeah.
Actually, yes, during the high point of his career, his most successful period was after this. He had not yet achieved that level. And this is considered, most historians, as linen. And linen is considered an inexpensive material. But you're right about the cloak. So it's a little bit of both. He's aspiring to the upper middle class. He hasn't achieved it yet, is what I'm saying. And that's how you have to write this because it's not the must know. But just so you know, he struggled financially through most of his life. Then for a few years, he did achieve success, and then everything fell apart. Now I'll explain. That's when the melancholia, the meaning of that will come clear. Okay, so it's self-portrait, but there's one other thing. Now, I don't know if any of you out of the whole class here, and you don't have to speak up if you don't want to, but I don't mind being self-deprecating. I don't think it is, but some people would call this a condition he has with one eye that doesn't focus with the other one. That when you get tired and you spend too long, like I do, looking at a computer screen for 3 hours a night teaching, it's called strabismus, but the common term is lazy eye syndrome. Oh, I hate that. Now that's discrimination. What, like you're born choosing to have one eye that doesn't, but oh, it's a birth defect. And my daughter had it. Can you believe it? We found her at the orphanage in Russia. One of the first things I noticed when she looked up at me and my wife, the first moment we met her, was she had the same condition. So did Rembrandt, and so did Dürer. A lot of famous artists have had that. And even famous people in the media today. Some usually you can have it fixed by expensive surgery, but you couldn't back then. So he had strabismus, which was a strike against him because, of course, some people considered it a hint of God punishing you, like ignorant people do. You know what I mean? I mean, so he had a birth defect that did make it difficult for him sometimes to create his art. Okay, but here's where I say he was ahead of his time. The next 2 slides, and we'll get to the must know. He's most famous. Now you should start writing the meaning. Now you should write the meaning. Why? Because his background is relevant to the.
Wait a minute, but we, excuse me.
Yes.
But we didn't even finish, the Melancholia, or whatever you pronounce that.
We didn't get to it.
The last one.
We didn't get to it yet. We haven't gotten to it yet. That's what I've been saying.
Oh, okay.
Get to it, I'll tell you. Okay, but it's
Okay,
important for me. I understand, you know, you want to be clear. So let me tell everyone. Now you should begin writing notes under the heading of Melancholia, which is, I'll go ahead and show you here. It's this slide. But we're not going to get to it for about 3 or 4 minutes because these next two are part of the meaning of who he was. Okay, everybody understand? You remember the artist's life is part of the meaning of their work, right? Everybody knows that by now because you should use that in your papers, right? Whatever you can find out about the artist, part of the meaning is usually related. Well, here are the facts you should know now. You start writing this. Who was Dürer? He is most famous for his engravings. His engravings are what made him successful to the degree that he was. He never was as successful as Michelangelo or Da Vinci, but he did have some success. His engravings are what he's famous for. That's the first fact about who he was. And then the others are that he was ahead of his time in his choice of subject matter. For instance, this is called Little Owl. He was arguing for preserving the environment and the natural habitat of animals and plants hundreds of years before most people even thought about the environment. He wrote books about it. He was also a published author, by the way. And he drew pictures of animals in their natural habitat or just like this, just on their own, and wrote that we need to protect and preserve the natural surroundings or someday we will regret it. You have any idea how far ahead of his time he was to say that in the early 1500s? He's one of the few, or even Da Vinci did. Well, he did a little bit. He said some things like that, but not to the degree. It was a passionate belief, there we go, of Dürer that people should not destroy natural habitat whenever possible. They should preserve it. And he did that through his art and his writings. But then this is maybe in a way somehow to me the most amazing, one of the two most amazing ways in which Dürer was ahead of his time. This is the first portrait of an adult Black woman or African woman, she was from Africa, in the history of Western art. That should grab your attention right there. Someone else wants to be admitted. Yeah. Hang on. We're just about we're just about to get to the next must know is Albert Dürer. And I'm right now we're just saying part of the meaning is who was Dürer, the artist. Okay, he was the first European or Western at that time, that's what it meant. European was Western artist to depict an adult African woman. Not only did he do a portrait of her, this is called the Negress. That's the title they would have used back then. It wasn't meant to be disrespectful at all. That was the title of this painting, Negress Ekaterina. He not only knew her, they were friends and they supported each other's businesses. After all, artists have to sell things. So she helped promote his art. And what did he do? He helped promote her business as an herbalist and today we would say a doula, right? A midwife. She was the only Black woman living in that city at that time. And he became friends with her. Part of the reason is look at her eyes. They had the same condition. They were very simpatico because they understood prejudice, both racial, of course he did. And again, he was way ahead of his time to depict an African woman with respect, accurately, with dignity. Well, no. Most people didn't even think about that. And if they did, they didn't show African people with any dignity.
This is in Germany, right?
He did. He was way ahead of his time. So now we're getting to the actual must know. Okay, everybody knows. This is the one that might be on the exam. That's Dürer. Here's the meaning of this slide. Melancholia 1, okay, by Dürer, 1515. So what's happening here? It is a moment in his, or period, you could say, or time in his life in which everything fell apart. He lost almost everything except his wife. His mother died. His wife became mentally ill. He lost his patronage, the supporters, patrons are the ones that keep you in alive, right? When you're an artist, somehow they abandoned him. There was an economic recession, there were wars, there were plagues, whatever the reasons. And that's true too. There were wars and plagues, which of course didn't only affect him, but his personal losses were worse than most people's because he lost his studio, his home, most of his clients or customers, you can say. Yeah, all within a short time. So he fell into a severe chronic depression. There's no other way to say it. He did not suffer from a birth condition, like manic depression, but he fell into, I'll say it again, during this period of loss in his life, where he lost almost everything he'd built or worked for.
Thank you.
He fell into severe depression. And that's him. That's him right there. Now, why is he part human, part angel, part male, part man, part woman? Because he's trying to make a point here. That's what makes this a remarkably advanced work of art, because he was suffering from temporary mental illness, you could call it that, right? Severe depression. Sometimes people don't recover from that. And right after Biden lost his, this is not again political, it's just a fact. Half his family in a car crash the day he was supposed to become his first day as a senator. He went into a chronic depression. People do, and they lose so much all at once. He's saying this could happen to anyone, a man, a woman, a figure from the church who thinks they're holy and rich and powerful, or a poor artist like me. A baby, there we have a cherub, a baby angel. Look, even the cherub is depressed. And even the dog, the family pet, look, is depressed. He's leaving all of his tools because he's not a sculptor, but this figure is meant to symbolize artists in general, not just himself and engraving. He did both painting and engraving, but he's more famous, as I said, for engraving. So he has some of the tools of an engraver, but he also has other tools around him that are lying unused. In other words, he's given up on his art, which he did after for about a year, not after, for about a year or so. He produced hardly any work, except he wanted to do this series. And here's the last fact, the most amazing fact about this engraving, this image. Did anybody know how people with mental illness, whether it was temporary or lifelong, how they were treated at that time? Anybody know? You probably.
Oh yeah, they were ostracized. They believed that those people were possessed by demons, if I
Yes,
recall correctly.
exactly. That they were themselves guilty of some sin, or God just didn't favor them, so they were being punished for something. And they were chained to walls, whipped, beaten, denied food, kept in dungeons. Oh yeah, there was no understanding or empathy. So what's his message? The last part of the meaning here is he's saying to anyone who's ever been through this or knows someone in their family, or who might someday go through a depression like this, because things happen and life doesn't always give you flowers and rose, obviously sometimes we all have hard times. He's saying this could happen to anybody, so we should all be sympathetic when people are going through depression, or if they were born with it. It would, that's so far ahead of his time. It's like 400 years. I mean, Freud was talking about that in the very late 1800s, early 1900s. And there were some reformers in the early 1800s, mostly women, by the way, who were nurses, who were saying we should not treat mentally ill people or people temporarily suffering from depression like they were evil. But that's still, what, 350 years later? So he was just centuries, you have to be specific, ahead of his time with the topics that he chose to illustrate in his engravings, including sympathy for mentally ill sufferers. Okay, now this whole section of the painting, nobody knows what these mean. There's some kind of, I think I can get rid of that. Let's see. It's not wanting to go away yet. Okay, I'm trying to, oh, well, okay. Let me just get it out of the way. See, what this is an hourglass. It means we're all going to die someday, which is a depressing thought if you get too much into it. And then you have, of course, numerology. Sorry, numbers, which nobody knows. I've had people debate in my classes what those numbers mean. Nobody knows. He had some kind of symbolic meaning that he either didn't write or was lost after he died. Anyway, this was going to be a series. That's why it's called Melancholia 1. Oh, by the way, some of you, if you're very observant, you notice that's the German spelling. They don't use an H. So if it's on the exam, you have no excuse. Of course, you can look up in your notes for not knowing the title. And you can spell it either that way, the German way, because there it is right in front of you, right, on the engraving, or the way it is on the syllabus, which is the English spelling. Either one's acceptable. There is hope, though. There is only one little hint. That's a rainbow on the horizon and a shooting star. That symbolizes there's hope. And he eventually overcame this. And his wife came out of her temporary mental illness, so she never totally recovered. She wasn't ever all there, but she might have had early Alzheimer's. I had a brother-in-law who suffered from that, and he was dead by 45. It's terrible when it hits you that early. It's usually fatal. So I don't remember. I think his wife did live till shortly after he died. Anyway, he recovered partially from the setbacks, but it was a very difficult time for him, and he's displaying that here. All right, that's plenty on the meaning. This is an easy one to do formal analysis. There is no warm or cool colors. It's all neutral, black and white, obviously. It's full of the rhythm of the bodies, the human bodies, and the tools, and even the ladder and the numbers on the wall. Lots of rhythm. Is it stable or dynamic? I'd say the background is stable on the wall, but everything else is pretty, maybe the dog. But the figures here, there's a lot of dynamic detail. Obviously, all the objects around them. Someone still is now back to playing something in the background.
What did you say about the rhythm of this painting?
It's full of the human body rhythm, and of course the objects surrounding them, the ladder, the numbers. I mean, lots of rhythm. And the cinematic textures are superb, as is a master engraver's skill. He's done with carved line. Remember, how is an engraving made? You carve into metal. That's how you, or wood. In this case, it's metal. Right? There are two kinds of engravings: wood cuttings or metal. And this is a copper metal engraving. You don't have to know that. Just say the line is all carved, and that's both bold. You see bold outline, see it, right? And then, of course, thin around many of the objects. I hear somebody. Hello, is somebody can hear me who has their mic on and is listening to TV in the background? Could you turn it down? Thank you. Okay, and then it's balanced. I think it is left to right, but you could make the case that because he's such a large figure, that all of these together, I see this as one mass, the cherub, the dog, and the block of stone. I think it's roughly balanced left to right, but definitely weighted toward the bottom. For space, you've got overlapping, foreshortening, of course, diminishing size, obviously, and scientific perspective. It can't, by definition, have atmospheric perspective because it's not in color. And of course, the modeling, I already said, is super sharp, but I think one or two of you might have missed that. That's what he was a master at, depicting textures and modeling very realistically with his carved lines. Okay, this is the next must know. We're certainly still going to end early, okay? This one is the burial of Count Orgaz. I know that sounds odd. His last name, Orgaz. Burial of Count Orgaz. The artist's name, I'm sure most of you heard of him, El Greco. Two words, El, of course, it's Spanish for the Greek. E-L and then G-R-E-C-O, El Greco, 1586. Okay, so what do we see here? We see the most famous Mannerist painter. No one would argue with that, was El Greco. And this is an example of why he became the most famous Mannerist artist, because of his exaggerated techniques. He became known for two signature motifs. I've used that phrase, but not very often. And I'm going to use it more and more as we go on in this course throughout the semester, because it's a good word to know. I mean, you don't have to use it if this is on the exam, but signature motifs are techniques invented by a particular artist and that they used, and it marks their work, as theirs. So what are his signature motifs? They are an undulating, writhing effect to the main figures and objects. Look carefully. This is the hands of God admitting the spirit, ghost, soul, whatever word you want to use, of the Count, the one at the bottom who's being buried, into heaven. So an angel's carrying his soul into heaven to meet Jesus, right? There's Jesus. So what do we see? We see clouds that are in the shape of the hands of God. You see them with the fingers and the thumb there? So they are undulating or writhing, as are Jesus's robes. Whoops, sorry, I meant to keep on that. See that? The robes, I mean, why would that happen unless there's a windstorm in heaven, right? So he uses many undulating and writhing objects throughout his paintings. That's one of his two signature motifs that he invented. No one had done that before. And then later, a man named Van Gogh was inspired 300 years later to do the same thing. Okay, what's the other signature motif? Elongated limbs on the main figures. And that really is clear when you look at John the Baptist. That's who this is, right? With his arms and legs. Jesus, whoops, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get, let's get him up close. There we go. Look at his arm. He can touch his toes while he's sitting down. I mean, that arm is impossibly long. And even Peter, this is Peter, right? Saint Peter, that supposedly was the first disciple of Jesus, is up in heaven now, of course. And he's supposed to have the keys to heaven. There they are. But his fingers are twice as long as the normal human fingers would be. So elongated limbs and body parts, you could say, on the main figures is the second signature motif that El Greco always used. And here it's very obvious. But what's going on? There's not a lot to say about it, but the scene it depicts is an actual event that occurred hundreds of years earlier in Spain, where this count, a rich, nobleman, you can call him just a nobleman or count, is being buried by the Catholic bishop, right? The local bishop and priests. In a church, of course, he's being buried as a holy man. He never became a saint, or else it would say the burial of Saint or Gaz. He didn't become a saint, but the Catholic Church admired him for giving money to and helping the poor. That's, I guess not an uncommon, right, thing that people who have plenty of money choose, some of them, to do that, right? So he became very, very popular with many Catholics, and especially the Catholic Church itself, because he was an example of doing good works. They called it. You don't have to write that phrase, but helping poor people less fortunate than him. That's him, if it's not obvious. Being buried in his full armor there, and then here's the local bishop. Here's a altar boy, and here's the son of El Greco. He put his son's portrait in many of his paintings. Some think this is El Greco himself, but there's no evidence for that. It could be any of these men, because he did have a pointed beard, but so did most men, middle-aged men at that time. And obviously these are priests on either end. Okay, so that's the main part of the meaning of this. It depicts a real historical event a couple hundred years after it occurred. Why was it done? Because El Greco was the official painter, the official Spanish painter for the Catholic Church. He wasn't Spanish. He wasn't Greek. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, he was. He wasn't Spanish. He came from Greece, but he learned Spanish. He moved there and he stayed there because the Catholic Church had a lot of money in Spain, and they could afford to pay him well to do paintings of scenes from the history of the Catholic Church, which is what you're seeing here. All right, that's pretty much the whole meaning. Formal analysis is balance. Oh yeah, this is clearly either side here. The figures are at the funeral, and this area here is it's balanced top to bottom and left to right. Full of the rhythm of these men's heads, their beards, their collars, these ruffles, they call them. I mean, it's repeated shapes everywhere. And of course, the arms and hands and legs of the figures in heaven here, Jesus, Mary, John the Baptist, and other saints. And then we have simulated texture is pretty sharp and realistic. The modeling is mostly also strong on all the human figures and the holy ones. But on the clouds, it's a little soft and diffused. But that makes sense because they're supposed to be clouds disguised, or the other way around, the hands of God disguised as clouds. But everything else, the modeling is super sharp and realistic. The outlines here are all thin around all the objects. It is stable. On the bottom, only these two figures. I mean, maybe this section right here, because in a way his body is diagonal. So the three figures literally around the count are dynamic, but look at all the other mourners. They're all stiff upright, and that's all stable, mostly stable. Whereas up above in heaven, the figures are mostly dynamic, aren't they? Except maybe Jesus, but even his arm is at a diagonal. So. All right, and then let's see, colors. Of course, it's cool on the clouds / God's hands, and on Jesus's robes and one priest, but most of the two of the priest's robes, but most of the rest of them, the clothing and certainly all the skin tones are warm. And for space, you have overlapping and foreshortening and diminishing size. There's no scientific or atmospheric perspective. Overlapping for shortening and diminishing size. Okay, we've got two more. Oh, there's a close-up. I forgot I had this. Yeah, you can see the undulating, writhing effect of the two hands of God. This looks more like a fist to me, but in any case, this one clearly is supposed to be the hand of God, you know, opening up the gates of heaven for this soul of the count. Okay, but we've already covered that, so let's move on. Okay, I will mention that this depicts a scene at the end of Jesus' life, right before he died, actually, just before, near the end of his life, in which he was arrested by the Roman soldiers, and he asked God, "Why do I have to?" You have to write this down; I must know. But I think it's more than a little chilling, spine tingling is a better word. Sorry, if you know the fact of what he's depicting here. These are olive trees. Okay, whoops. Sorry. Hello. Yeah, we're just about to get to the next must know, but this isn't a must know. Okay, so we know where Jesus was arrested. That, again, the Romans kept records of. It's still there. The courtyard itself, the buildings, they're more than 2,000 years old. Jerusalem's a 3,000-year-old city, as some of you may know. So I've been there. I've seen it. And I stood in that courtyard, and I asked the Israeli tour guide, look at all these olive trees. I'd seen this painting already. It was after I started teaching at the JC. I said, there were olive trees around the courtyard. I said, in that painting by El Greco, it's interesting, the same species of trees. That's why these trees were planted here. And the guide looked at me and he said, I couldn't believe it, but there were scientists with us. And they said, yes, it's true. No, he said, not only are they the same species of trees that were here when Jesus was arrested, they are the same trees. I had no idea that olive trees could live 1,000 years, but man, they do. They have, and they're in the Middle East. There are 2,000-year-old olive trees. Okay, I'm going to decide. Yeah, there we go. Just we're going to do Palladio, two more, and then we'll still end a few minutes early. Okay, this one, I'm going to cut one of them, okay? This one is Villa Rotunda, two words.
Okay,
Villa. Hi, you have a question? Okay. Villa, V-I-L-L-A, you know, it's a country house in Italy. Villa Rotunda, which, you know, is the part of the building where the dome is, like the U.S. Capitol has. Rotunda, R-O-T-U-N-D-A. The artist was an architect, of course. He's the artist. Architects are artists, of course. Palladio, P-A-L-L-A-D-I-O, Palladio, 1569.
Excuse me.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Is this the must know?
Yes, it is. It is. That's why I was giving you the title. Yes, yes.
What's it called?
You see it there near the bottom? Villa Rotunda. Okay, so let's start with the fact that Palladio is the father. I'm going to say it slowly and repeat it. It's not as obvious as it might sound the first time you hear it, unless you know who he was. Palladio is considered to be the father of the modern profession of architecture. Not the father of modern architecture. This isn't modern at all. I'll say it again. Palladio is considered to be the father of the modern profession of architecture. Why do we say that? Well, this is all part of the meaning. Because he wrote several books on how to practice the field of architecture. And those books are still taught in colleges all over the world, architecture programs, of course, in schools. I know because UC Berkeley has an architecture program where they assign in English, translated, of course, from Italian. So he's the first professional architect to write about his own profession in a way that still is relevant today, about what architects should think about, how they should compose a building, and what you don't have to know the details, but the point is, his books are still being used by architecture programs all over the world, 500 years later, or nearly 500. Another reason that he's so influential is he is the, let's just say, precursor, forerunner. You can use either word, one word, forerunner, one word, or precursor, don't worry how to spell it, write it like it sounds. Either word will do, of Baroque, which we'll get to next week. Baroque architecture becomes a new phase, a late Renaissance phase. We don't worry about what it means now, we'll define it next week. This building is a forerunner or precursor of, in other words, it's several decades ahead of its time. That's another way of saying it, because it uses so much ornamental detail like these statues lining each of the porticos, and multiple porticos. He's the first architect. Now, here's the last thing about the meaning and why this building is the one of his we show. He did hundreds of buildings all over northern Italy. He was from Venice, by the way. You can see his churches all over Italy. Well, what's left of them, there's probably about 100 now, but he did several hundred buildings. Anyway, his homes, this house, I'm sorry, this home, it's a private residence, is the first one, at least in Europe, to use multiple porticos. Where have we seen that? Let's see, Washington, D.C. Which, the one that's all white? Of course, it inspired the White House, this building. The use of multiple porticos, and almost every southern plantation mansion too, as well as all over England, where Georgian architecture, this style that the English were imitating the Italians. So just keep it simple and say it this way. I'll repeat that this is the first private residence. Therefore, Palladio is the first architect to use multiple porticos. You can't see here, but there are four, one on each side. Any other house before that, if it even had a columned porch, that's what a portico is, a porch supported by columns, or columned with an ED porch. If a house had it, it was just one on the front and the main entrance. Here it's on all four sides. And then also it is the first private residence. You say house or private residence, they mean the same thing, to use a rotunda. That's reserved for mostly public buildings, right? Like town halls and capitals, right? And churches. It had a rotunda, a private house with a rotunda. No one had done that before him. So it broke many new firsts, this house. Or should I say, introduced many new ideas or new features for residential design or home design. And his books, like I said, well, Thomas Jefferson introduced him to American architecture students. You know, Thomas Jefferson was our first architect in America, right? He taught himself. He went to Europe before the Revolution even, I think, or was it during the Revolution, and brought back these books, translated them, or had someone help him translate them into English, and donated them to universities that were just beginning to have a department of architecture. They didn't call it that, but it was very early roots of architectural programs for American designers. And it wouldn't have happened without Palladio's books and Jefferson recognizing that they were valuable. So that's plenty on the meaning of this. Let's wrap it up and do one more slide. That is the weirdest, one of the two weirdest you'll see tonight. And we should still end at least several minutes early. Okay, so wrapping it up, this is, by definition, any Renaissance building is symmetrical, left to right. But of course, if you count this as the top part, it's got a lot of empty air on either side of the dome. So of course, that means it's weighted or unbalanced toward the bottom. It's full of the rhythm of the columns. The porches themselves, they're called porticos. I'm pretty sure I used that word before, Portico. That's what these are. I've already mentioned it tonight, this slide, but if you didn't know it, it's a columned porch. So they're repeated exactly the same shape, as are the windows, of course, the stairs. So lots of rhythm. It is stable mostly. The only things dynamic are these little tiny bits of curved arches and just in the sides of the porches or porticos, and the dome or rotunda. Rotunda is the space beneath a dome. The dome is the actual structure. So that's dynamic. Everything else is stable. The colors, warm on the roof, and this was an off-white plaster. It's fading here, but the walls are cool. The roofs are, including the dome, warm red. And then this is a warm, see, look at the color there. That's obviously warm stone, kind of yellow kind of stone that you see a lot in Italy. There's only shadows from the sun, no modeling techniques. For space, it's a large open room with a dome in the middle, surrounded by many other smaller rooms, of course. The rotunda is the largest space, always, in any building with a dome. The room with the dome is always the biggest. Okay, and let's see, there's visual line. It's a little bit of carved line just at the entrance there. It mentions the name of the person whose house it is. Of course, their ego demanded that, I'm sure. So there's a small amount of carved line, but mostly it's just the visual line around the edges. Okay, we're going to wrap it up with one last bizarre Mannerist slide, and this is the Last Supper, very different than the one we saw last week. The artist's name is Tintoretto, Tintoretto, Tintorretto, The Last Supper, 1594, almost exactly 100 years, or very close to 100 years, a century after Da Vinci. Totally different. There's no comparison except that it depicts the same scene, which is a scene in the life of Jesus, you could say, or just say the Bible, in which, that's him, by the way, Jesus, in which he meets for the last time with all his disciples right before he's about to be arrested. And if it's not obvious that Jesus has the largest halo, brightest halo, and largest, that is Judas. See, it's the same technique. It's not about racial or ethnic identity. It's about dramatic effect to show that the evil person, the villain in the scene, is shown in darker lighting. And then we have a signature motif of Tintoretto, who was from Venice too, by the way. By this time, there were a lot of famous painters in Venice. He would always show mythical creatures, in this case, angels from heaven, around the outer edge of his paintings. Look at them here. Here they are flitting along the ceiling of this inn. And they're coming out of the light. It looks like they're coming out of the oil lamp right here. And then he used another signature motif, is extreme chiaroscuro. Now remember that Da Vinci had done that, yes. But in a scene from the Bible, no, he didn't do that. The entire background is deep black. That is a rather odd, detail. But the most controversial detail is that he's showing the setting. You see where they are, this filthy floor, this scrub maid here, this woman probably paid peanuts to do all that hard work, and even the way the people are dressed, it's a dive. The point is, it's an insult according to the Catholic Church. They wouldn't have met in a dive, holy figures like Jesus and all his disciples. Well, what else could they afford? They were homeless, they were beggars. So it makes more sense actually than the Catholic Church's version of this scene. So that was controversial, as were the angels flitting around the sky. And then of course one last thing, look at the angle. This is totally different. Da Vinci shows us this table from head on, right, with Jesus in the middle. Here we have everyone lined up at a diagonal. The table itself, of course, is positioned at an odd angle. That's called an oblique angle. You don't have to know that word, but you can just say an extreme or odd or unusual angle, veering off at a diagonal. That no one had ever shown this scene from the Bible like that. Okay, so those are all the things that make this different, controversial, and very obviously a Mannerist painting, because of the exaggerated details I just gave you. Okay, let's wrap it up. Formal analysis. Well, it's balanced, I think. But there are people who say, well, all the disciples are over on the left. But I think with the floor itself and the larger figures in the waitstaff, that's where these people are, and these angels, I think it's, if you drew the line where Jesus is standing, I think it's roughly balanced left to right, but you decide. Again, depending on how you look at these ghost-like figures in the ceiling, if you don't think of them as having mass, then it's clearly unbalanced, which most people probably would feel, weighted toward the bottom. The rhythm is obvious. The human bodies, their heads and arms, you don't see their legs. The food on the table, the angels on the ceiling, right? The floor tiles, right? Lots of rhythm. It is stable and dynamic. Stable on some of the disciples that are sitting upright, and on the corners of the room, what little you can see in the dark of those. But overall, because of the diagonal angle of the table and the floor, and the motion or movement of most of the human figures and all of the angels up above, it's mostly dynamic with only a few stable details. All the lines are thin outline. The modeling is very strong. Of course, the chiaroscuro, the dark black wall, is a form of modeling. So very strong, powerful modeling on the human figures, and strong, realistic simiad textures on their hair, their skin, their clothing, the floor tiles even. And I would even argue on the ceiling, right? Because those are supposed to be wooden beams here. And the oil lamp even. I mean, that's, very much more detail than you usually see on the ceiling of any other scene. So anyway, he's created this unique version of this. And let's see, space. Here we have diminishing, foreshortening, you can see obviously on the table, on the floor, diminishing size on the heads, of course, upper bodies of the disciples and the other figures. Overlapping And here there is scientific perspective. It may not be obvious, but we know he used a vanishing point somewhere behind the wall, but there's no atmospheric perspective here. The colors, last but not least, well, obviously a mixture of cool, 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 warm, 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 warm on the ceiling and the lamp and the angels, and they have a yellowish cast to them. So it's a mixture of cool and warm. Okay, well, we're finishing about 5 minutes early, which is pretty good for having covered all this without rushing. And we are going to probably have to cut the Return of the Hunters, but I might leave it in. I'll wait and see next week. It's a very interesting painting, but I don't want to run late. So, okay, anybody have any questions? I stick around. I'll do this every night at the end of each lecture. For those who have questions that aren't about the syllabus, unless it's about this slide, because we've covered all the others. This will all be, if you missed the first part or any of it, you remember by 7 p.m. Friday, you can see the video of the entire class. Posted on YouTube. Okay, anybody have any questions? Because you to start writing your papers, researching at least, and if not actually writing them between now and next class, don't forget I will send you all an email as a PDF attachment of the 1-page cover sheet, which you need to attach and include with the PDF of your paper when you submit it. I will remind you of that and send you a couple more emails about how to do that. To make sure you submit it correctly. Okay, any questions anybody has now about anything relating to your...
Just a curiosity question about the is Eisenheim Altarpiece?
Yes.
Do you know where exactly in Germany Eisenheim was? Because I know that back then Germany wasn't one nation. It was...
Sure, you don't need to know for the exam, but it's an interesting point. It's along the Rhine. I don't know if it's right on the Rhine. I can't remember. I actually saw it on a map. I was a guest of the German tourism ministry, whatever they call it, department of the government. I mean, they paid for my trip. That's how I got to a lot of parts of the world, because I would promise to write articles after I finished my trip about the food and wine of Germany, which isn't known for its high cuisine, but whatever. Hey, it was free. Anyway, the point is that it's not far from where Martin Luther lived and worked. And it's not too far from the city of Worms. I know it sounds funny. City of Worms, yeah, but it's with a V in German, W-O-R-M-S. And the painting is gone from that church. It's in a museum. I believe that museum, it could be Cologne, but I think it's in Munich. It's in a big city that's not very close. So it eventually was taken out of the church, but by choice, the church either gave it or sold it to a museum. And it's still on the exhibit in a museum in a different city. But Eisenheim's not a very big city, but it's not a tiny little town either. It was a center of the movement of protest against the Catholic Church.
Yeah, since back then Germany was not a united country.
Right, a bunch of little princes
of the German population didn't like the Catholic faith. Should underline just how discontented they were.
Oh yeah, because Luther comes along, if you know your history, right, 4 years after that painting, and nailed his thesis to the doors of the church in Württemberg. I can never remember. Is Württemberg? Not in,
yeah, I don't remember either.
Yeah. Well, Worms is a city where he was called to account for himself and could have been easily arrested and executed, but somehow he managed to talk, truth to power, whatever phrase you want. I mean, really, he was not backing down. He refused to withdraw any of his complaints. And then not long after that, he decided there's no way of reforming from within the Catholic Church with the current leaders of the church. So, maybe it's time for a new branch, a new version of Christianity. And of course, that's the birth of Protestantism comes right about then. So that's why that painting is sort of like a hint of what's to come very soon after it was made. Okay, any other questions, comments, anything about your papers or any other information you guys need? Okay, well, look for your inbox by either, late Friday evening or Saturday, maybe even sooner, and you'll see the cover sheet. So you do want to keep that, download it and keep it for when your papers are due, which is 2 weeks from tonight. Okay, good night. See you guys next week.
Hello, sir.
Thanks.
Good night.
Take care. See you all. Have a good week.